Childhood and the kingdom of King Adrian. Prince Julian grew up within the walls of a magnificent palace, where every hallway echoed with the sounds of royal life. His father, King Adrian, was a man of strength and wisdom, beloved by all who lived within his kingdom. The kingdom was a place of peace and prosperity, where justice ruled and the people lived in harmony. King Adrian had earned the title of Adrian the Just for his ability to govern fairly and without bias. The country flourished under his reign, with thriving trade routes, rich cultural heritage, and a well-trained military. Julian, as a young boy, often wandered the palace grounds, his curiosity constantly leading him to the grand libraries and secret chambers of the royal estate. His mother, Queen Elise, often told him stories of his father's rise to power. She would describe how King Adrian had been a humble knight before he became king, rising through the ranks by his courage and unshakable belief in justice. One of Julian's most cherished memories was of walking with his father through the gardens of the royal palace. King Adrian would always speak to him as an equal, sharing wisdom that would one day shape Julian's own future. A ruler's true strength, King Adrian would say, is not measured by the size of his army or the wealth of his lands, but by the trust and love of his people. Julian spent countless hours with his father, learning the arts of diplomacy, statecraft, and leadership. As a young prince, he was tutored by the finest teachers from around the kingdom. History, philosophy, and military strategy were subjects that Julian studied intensely. He knew that one day, these lessons would serve him well. He grew particularly close to his childhood friend, Elias, who was also being trained to become one of the king's most trusted generals. Elias and Julian would often practice sword fighting and strategy games together, laughing and dreaming of the day when they would face real battles. As the years passed, the kingdom flourished under King Adrian's reign. The people were content, the roads were safe, and the countryside was rich with harvests. The country was united and strong, thanks to the wise leadership of King Adrian. Julian's heart swelled with pride every time he saw his father address the people, always calm, always just, never showing signs of arrogance. Adrian ruled not with fear, but with respect and love for his people. But even in times of peace, the kingdom was not free from external threats. Rumors of nearby lands seeking expansion and power were growing louder each day. While his father kept the kingdom secure, Julian often heard whispers about the growing tension at the borders. A new power was rising in the east, and many feared that it was only a matter of time before they would be forced to defend their peaceful lands. For Julian, life in the palace was filled with love and comfort. Yet, he could not ignore the deep sense of duty that weighed on his young shoulders. He knew that one day, his father would pass the crown to him, and when that day came, he would be ready. But for now, he was content to learn and grow, safe in the knowledge that his father's reign was a symbol of hope and stability for their people. Prince Julian's childhood was marked by the vast expanse of his father's kingdom, a land that stretched as far as the eye could see, from the rolling hills in the north to the sparkling rivers in the south. The capital city, Riverrun, where the royal palace stood, was a marvel of architectural beauty, with towers that reached the sky and gardens that bloomed year-round. Inside the palace walls, the life of the royal family was lived in peace and luxury, but it was a life also steeped in duty. King Adrian, Julian's father, was a man of unmatched wisdom and compassion. He was beloved by his people, not only for his just rule but also for his ability to listen, understand, and make decisions that served the greater good. His reign had brought prosperity to the kingdom, and his people had flourished. It was said that under King Adrian's rule, there were no beggars on the streets, no unjust taxes, and no unrest, only peace. Julian, as a boy, had always been in awe of his father. He would often sit beside him in the royal council chambers, watching as King Adrian made decisions with a calm and steady hand. His father never rushed, never spoke hastily, and always considered every angle before making a decree. Patience and wisdom are the marks of a true leader, King Adrian would often say, patting Julian on the shoulder with a smile. A ruler must think beyond the moment, for the consequences of a decision can echo for generations. But while King Adrian was known for his wisdom, he was also a great warrior in his youth. His journey to the throne had not been easy. He had fought in countless battles, risen through the ranks of the royal army, and earned the trust of the people through his courage and dedication. His father, the previous king, had passed away unexpectedly, and Adrian had assumed the throne at a young age, facing numerous threats from rival nations and internal strife. Yet, through it all, he had emerged victorious, gaining the respect of even his fiercest enemies. Julian had always admired his father's bravery and strength, but he was more captivated by the way his father governed. As a young boy, Julian would often sit in the palace gardens, watching the people of Riverrun go about their daily lives. He saw them smiling, greeting one another, and working together. It was in these moments that he realized what made his father such a great king, his ability to unite people, to make them feel like they were a part of something greater than themselves. As a child, Julian spent much of his time with his friends, the children of noble families from across the kingdom. His closest friend was Elias, the son of the kingdom's chief general. Elias was strong, loyal, and adventurous, traits that Julian admired deeply. Together, they would explore the forests surrounding the palace, playing games of strategy and mock battles. The two of them often talked about the future, about the possibility of becoming great leaders, just like King Adrian. But while Julian's youth was filled with joy and play, there were signs of looming danger in the distance. The kingdom was not the only power in the land. There were rumors of neighboring kingdoms growing, restless kingdoms that coveted the resources and wealth of Riverrun. And while King Adrian's reign had been one of peace, Julian's eyes had begun to open to the harsh realities of ruling a kingdom. He knew that his father's time on the throne would not last forever, and that one day, he would have to take his place. One of Julian's earliest memories was of sitting on his father's knee in the royal throne room, listening to King Adrian speak of the importance of preparation. A ruler, his father had said, must be ready for anything, for there are always challenges ahead, and sometimes they come when you least expect them. As Julian grew older, he began his own training in the ways of leadership. His education was rigorous. Every day, he studied the history of their kingdom, the lands beyond, and the art of diplomacy. He spent time in the royal army, learning the tactics that his father had once used to win battles and secure peace. But despite all of his studies, Julian knew that there was one thing he would never truly understand until it was his turn to rule: the weight of the crown, the burden of making decisions that affected not only his life but the lives of everyone in his kingdom. At night, Julian would often lie awake, staring at the ceiling of his chambers, wondering what the future held. Would he be as wise as his father? Would he be able to protect the kingdom and its people? These questions swirled in his mind, but he never spoke them aloud. Instead, he continued his studies and spent more time with his father, learning everything he could from the great King Adrian. The peace that Julian knew, however, would not last forever. As whispers of unrest and war began to grow louder from neighboring lands, Julian felt the stirrings of a challenge on the horizon. And when the day came, when the trumpets sounded and the armies gathered for war, Julian would be ready not just as the son of King Adrian, but as the future ruler of Riverrun. The sun had barely risen over Riverrun when the royal council convened. King Adrian, now an older and more seasoned ruler, stood at the head of the great oak table in the council room, his expression serious. Julian, now a young man in his 20s, stood beside him, observing the proceedings closely. For years, he had been learning from his father, absorbing every piece of wisdom that had been imparted to him, but today was different. Today, the kingdom faced a challenge it hadn't encountered in decades: war. The rumors of unrest in the neighboring kingdoms had finally taken root. King Adrian's spies had confirmed the reports. An ambitious ruler to the east, King Malga, had been consolidating power, building a formidable army, and eyeing Riverrun's fertile lands. The kingdom of Riverrun, while powerful and respected, was not the only kingdom vying for dominance. Malga's forces were said to be massive, and his ambition seemed insatiable. The council room was filled with the kingdom's greatest military minds, advisors, and generals. The atmosphere was heavy with tension as the realization set in that war was inevitable. Julian listened carefully as the commanders discussed strategies and resources, each one contributing their expertise, offering advice, and debating plans of attack. As much as he had learned from his father, he had never been in a war room like this one. This was the moment that would shape his future. King Malga has a sizable army, General Elias, now a seasoned officer, said. We cannot underestimate his strength. His forces are well trained, and they outnumber us 3-1. But we have something he doesn't: unity. Our people stand with us, and our soldiers are loyal. King Adrian nodded. True. But loyalty is not enough. We must prepare strategically, or we risk losing everything. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Julian, I need you to take command of the training camps. I want every soldier ready for the fight of their lives. We cannot afford any weaknesses. Julian stood straighter. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His father had always trusted him, but now the responsibility was more real than ever. He had been learning from the best generals in the kingdom, but this would be his first real test. The weight of the crown felt heavier as he accepted his father's request. Yes, father, Julian said, his voice steady, though his heart raced with the enormity of the task. I won't let you down. As the council meeting continued, Julian's thoughts began to race. This was no longer a time for games or practice. The army had to be prepared for war, and every single soldier needed to be sharp. He needed to ensure that they could fight not only with skill but with the same loyalty and unity that had been the foundation of Riverrun's strength. Later that day, Julian made his way to the training grounds. The air was thick with anticipation. Soldiers were practicing their drills, their swords clashing against shields, their armor shining in the afternoon sun. Julian watched closely, observing their form and technique. The training camp was large, with hundreds of soldiers preparing for battle. He could see the determination in their eyes, but he also saw the fear. War was coming, and many of these men had never fought in a real battle before. Elias, Julian called, spotting his friend among the ranks. Elias, who had risen to the position of general, approached quickly, his boots clicking against the stone path. "Julian, I can see the burden on your shoulders," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "Your father trusts you, and so do we. You're ready for this." Julian nodded, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. "I don't know if I am," he admitted. "This is real. This is what we've been preparing for, but I never imagined it would come so soon." Elias clapped him on the shoulder. "No one is ever truly ready for war, but you've learned everything you need to know. You've trained for this your whole life. Just remember what your father always says, lead with wisdom, and the rest will follow." Julian took a deep breath and turned his attention back to the soldiers. "Let's get started," he said. "We need every man at his best." For the next several weeks, Julian worked tirelessly to prepare the soldiers. He personally oversaw their training, pushing them to their limits. He spent long hours with the generals, reviewing tactics and strategies, making sure every detail was accounted for. As the days passed, Julian's confidence grew. The soldiers began to trust him, to look to him for guidance, and soon, the kingdom's army was ready, but it wasn't just the army that needed preparation. Julian's father had also called upon the people of Riverrun to support the war effort. The kingdom's farmers were asked to increase their crop yields, the blacksmiths worked around the clock to forge weapons, and the merchants provided the necessary supplies for the soldiers. It was all hands on deck as the kingdom mobilized for war. Julian's life had been consumed by the preparations for battle. Every day, he was in the field, training, strategizing, and organizing. But as the final days before the army's departure approached, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his father's expectations. He had always known this day would come, but now that it was here, the reality of leading an army into war was overwhelming. On the eve of their departure, Julian stood alone on the balcony of the palace, gazing out over the kingdom he had spent his entire life protecting. He thought of the people, the farmers, the merchants, the children, and the elderly. They had all placed their trust in him. He was no longer just the prince, he was now the commander, the protector of Riverrun. "Tomorrow, we march," Julian whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the wind. "And we will win. For them. For my father. For my kingdom." As the moon rose high above the horizon, Julian felt the stirring of something deep within him. A sense of duty, of courage, and of the legacy that was about to unfold. He was ready. The day had come. The army of Riverrun, now fully prepared, stood ready to march. King Adrian had assembled the most formidable force the kingdom had ever known, and Julian, as the new commander, was at its helm. The time had come to leave the familiar safety of Riverrun and venture into the unknown. Beyond the borders of their land, the soldiers lined up in perfect formation, their banners waving proudly in the wind. Julian stood at the front of the formation, his sword gleaming under the rising sun. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was unshakable. His army, his people, and his father were all depending on him. The road ahead would be long and filled with dangers, but Julian knew that he was ready for what lay ahead. The journey began early in the morning, the rhythmic sound of marching feet filling the air. The soldiers were accustomed to long treks, but this journey would be unlike any they had ever undertaken. They would cross dense forests, climb rugged mountains, and traverse vast plains before they reached the heart of the enemy's territory. It was a journey of great peril, but also one of hope. Every step brought them closer to their goal, the defeat of King Emalgard. As they traveled, Julian found himself contemplating the challenges ahead. The landscape was vast and untamed, much of it unknown to the people of Riverrun. The journey would take them through ancient forests and over treacherous mountain passes, each step into unfamiliar territory. The roads were not always clear, and the further they traveled, the more hostile the lands became. At one point during the journey, the army was forced to make camp in a dense forest. Julian had heard rumors of dangerous creatures that roamed the forests, and he was determined to keep the men alert and prepared. That night, as the soldiers gathered around their campfires, Julian and his trusted commanders discussed their plans. "Stay vigilant," Julian warned his generals. "We don't know what dangers lurk in these forests. We've heard rumors of beasts, large, wild creatures that could easily tear apart an unprepared army." The generals nodded, and the soldiers remained on high alert, keeping watch throughout the night. Despite their preparation, the night passed uneventfully, but Julian knew this was just the beginning. The journey would only grow more dangerous as they moved further from their homeland. Days turned into weeks, and the army marched tirelessly toward their destination. Along the way, they encountered many challenges. There were times when the weather turned against them, rainstorms and high winds that made the journey almost impossible. There were moments when morale faltered, when the soldiers' spirits waned under the weight of the long journey. But Julian remained a steady presence, always at the front, encouraging his men to push forward. One particularly difficult stretch of the journey led them through a vast, barren desert. The heat was unbearable, and the soldiers were exhausted. Water supplies ran low, and the land offered little in the way of shelter or comfort. At times, it seemed as though the endless sand dunes stretched on forever, with no end in sight. The men began to question whether they could continue. During one particularly difficult day, Julian rode out ahead of the main column. He was alone, feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. But as he ventured deeper into the desert, he was struck by something off in the distance. He spotted a group of riders approaching. They were not Riverrun soldiers, but travelers, seemingly out of place in the vast desert. As the riders drew closer, Julian saw that they were a group of nomads, their faces dark and weathered from years of traveling the unforgiving desert. They were an enigmatic group, with a reputation for surviving in the harshest of conditions. Julian greeted them cautiously, unsure of their intentions. "You are far from home, young prince," one of the nomads said, his voice deep and wise. "What brings you to the heart of the desert?" "We are on a journey," Julian explained, "to fight a war and defend our kingdom." The nomad nodded thoughtfully. "War is a treacherous path, one that not even the strongest armies can conquer without the wisdom to navigate its trials. If you seek to continue, there is a hidden oasis not far from here. It may provide you with the water you need to survive." Julian, thankful for the advice, thanked the nomads and returned to the main army. The oasis was a lifeline, a much-needed respite from the heat and exhaustion of the desert. With renewed energy, the soldiers pressed on, and the journey continued. Over time, Julian learned valuable lessons from these experiences: patience, resilience, and the importance of trusting those who had walked the path before him. The army grew closer with each challenge they faced, their bond strengthened by the trials they endured together, but it wasn't just the physical hardships that tested them. As they ventured deeper into enemy territory, Julian faced more difficult decisions, tactics, strategies, and leadership decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. There were moments of doubt, moments when Julian questioned whether the war was worth the cost. But every time, he reminded himself of the stakes. He thought of his people, his father, and the future of Riverrun. Finally, after months of grueling travel, the army arrived at the outskirts of King Malga's kingdom. The landscape had changed, from the desolate deserts to lush, rolling hills and forests. The enemy's land was rich and fertile, a stark contrast to the harsh journey they had just endured. The soldiers were tired, but they knew that the hardest part was still to come, the battle itself. And as Julian stood before his army, looking out over the enemy's land, he knew that they were ready. They had survived the trials of the journey. Now, they would face the greatest challenge of all: war. The air was thick with anticipation as Julian's army stood at the edge of the enemy's territory. The soldiers, though weary from their long journey, stood tall. The looming threat of war was palpable, and the weight of what they had been through together was now at the forefront of their minds. They had come so far, and now, standing at the precipice of a new chapter, they could feel the reality of the battle approaching. It had been a journey of unyielding determination, but they all knew that the hardest part was yet to come: the battlefield. King Malga's forces were formidable, an army that had laid waste to many kingdoms before Riverruns. They were ruthless, trained in the art of war, and led by a man whose desire for power was insatiable. But Julian was determined. His resolve was as solid as the steel of his sword. He would not let his father's legacy be tarnished by failure. "We have arrived," Julian said to his generals, his voice steady yet carrying the weight of leadership. "The time for words is over. We fight now, for our people and for our kingdom." The generals nodded in agreement, their faces hardened by the years of conflict. The soldiers gathered in formations, their armor clinking as they moved into position. It was an overwhelming sight, an entire army ready for war. Yet Julian could sense the unease in the air. Every man felt it, the uncertainty of the battle ahead. Would they be able to overcome the powerful forces of King Malga? Would they return home victorious, or would this be the end of the road? As the soldiers prepared for battle, Julian's mind wandered back to the journey they had just completed. All the sacrifices, the hardships they had endured, had led them to this moment. He thought of the nomads, of the oasis, of the long days spent marching through unforgiving terrain. He thought of the soldiers who had lost their strength, but pushed forward nonetheless. He thought of the people who relied on them, who depended on their victory. "We fight for Riverrun," Julian whispered to himself, more as a reminder than a declaration. "We fight for those who cannot fight." The battle lines were drawn as Julian's army faced King Malga's troops across a wide, open field. The tension between the two armies was almost unbearable, a silence hanging in the air before the inevitable clash. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the battlefield, as if the earth itself held its breath. Julian surveyed the enemy ranks, trying to gauge their numbers and strategies. He knew that King Malga was a master tactician, his army was well disciplined, and his generals were as ruthless as they came. The enemy's position was strong, But Julian had a plan, a strategy that would use his army's strengths to their advantage. The first wave of battle came swiftly. The sound of horns filled the air, signaling the start of the clash. The armies collided with a roar, the sound of metal striking metal echoing across the field. Julian led the charge, sword in hand, his heart pumping with adrenaline. His soldiers followed, a unified force, as they cut through the enemy ranks. The battle was fierce, and Julian fought with the determination of a man who had everything to lose. The air was thick with smoke from the fires of war, and Julian could hear the cries of his men as they clashed with King Malga's soldiers. Every swing of his sword was filled with purpose, every step taken with the weight of responsibility. His soldiers looked to him for guidance, for leadership, and he would not falter amidst the chaos. Julian spotted his father's banner flying high above the battlefield. It was a symbol of their strength, their unity, and their unwavering resolve. His heart swelled with pride. His father's spirit was with them, guiding them toward victory. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that King Malga's forces were no easy match. His soldiers fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, and they quickly pushed Julian's forces back. The battlefield became a blur of chaos, swords clashing, men falling, horses galloping. The line between life and death seemed impossibly thin. Despite the overwhelming odds, Julian's army refused to give up. Every soldier fought with everything they had, knowing that the future of their kingdom rested on their shoulders. The battle was no longer about honor or glory, it was about survival. Julian's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield, looking for any opening, any advantage they could use. That's when he spotted it. The enemy's left flank was vulnerable, a small gap in their formation. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. Forward! Push through the left flank! Julian shouted to his generals, who relayed the command to the soldiers. It was a last-ditch effort, and it would require every ounce of strength and determination they had. With a rallying cry, Julian and his soldiers surged toward the enemy's weak point. The battle was turning in their favor, but it was far from over. Julian could feel the weight of the war upon him, the pressure mounting with every strike, every breath. And then, just as victory seemed within their grasp, disaster struck. Julian's father, King Adrian, was struck by an enemy spear. The blow was fatal, and Julian saw his father fall before him, blood staining the earth beneath him. A wave of grief and rage consumed Julian, but there was no time to mourn. His father's legacy had been passed on to him now. With the strength of his father's spirit within him, Julian rallied his forces one final time. "For River Run," he shouted. And with that, the soldiers pushed forward with renewed determination. They fought with everything they had, and the tide of battle began to turn. King Malga's forces, exhausted and demoralized, began to retreat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Julian's army emerged victorious. The enemy was broken, their forces scattered. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, but Riverrun had won. But the cost had been great. Julian stood amidst the wreckage, his heart heavy with the loss of his father. He had won the war, but at a great personal sacrifice. The field was silent now, save for the sounds of the wounded and the victorious cries of his soldiers. The sun began to set on the battlefield, casting long shadows over the wreckage of war. The smoke of the burning battlefield hung in the air, a heavy reminder of the fierce conflict that had just taken place. Julian stood at the edge of the carnage, his armor bloodied and worn, but his eyes focused on the horizon. The sounds of triumph and mourning filled the air as his soldiers celebrated the victory, but Julian could not join in. His heart was heavy with grief, and the weight of the crown now felt like a burden he was not sure he was ready to carry. His father, King Adrian, the man who had ruled Riverrun with wisdom and justice, had fallen in battle. Julian had seen it with his own eyes, the fatal blow that had taken his father's life. The man who had guided him through his youth, taught him the importance of duty and honor, was gone. Now, it was Julian's turn to lead, but the task ahead felt overwhelming. He walked slowly across the battlefield, his thoughts consumed by the loss. He had been prepared to fight for Riverrun, but he had never imagined that he would lose his father in the process. His hands trembled as he reached his father's body, still lying in the dirt. The king's once proud face was now a mask of peace, but Julian could not bring himself to feel relief. His father was gone, and with him, a part of Julian himself. Kneeling beside his father's body, Julian whispered, "I will honor you, Father. I will carry on your legacy." But deep down, he wasn't sure if he was ready. The thought of leading Riverrun without his father by his side seemed impossible. The burden of ruling, of protecting his people, now rested entirely on his shoulders. As the soldiers began to gather the wounded and prepare for the journey home, Julian gave the orders to begin the burial of the fallen. His generals were quick to follow his lead, but Julian could see the exhaustion in their eyes. It had been a long, grueling battle, and everyone was weary, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Yet, there was no time to mourn. Riverrun had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And now, the future of the kingdom rested in Julian's hands. He spent the night in solitude, contemplating the road ahead. The war with King Malga was only one chapter in the long and tumultuous history of Riverrun. Julian knew that even though they had won, there would be more challenges waiting for them. But what worried him most was his own uncertainty. Would he be able to live up to the expectations his father had set? Would he be able to lead Riverrun with the same wisdom and strength his father had? The next morning, Julian gathered his remaining generals and soldiers for a briefing. He stood before them, feeling the weight of their gazes on him. He was their king now, and he knew that they would look to him for guidance, just as they had looked to his father. The responsibility was enormous, but Julian could no longer afford to be uncertain. He had to take charge, not just for himself, but for the kingdom that depended on him. "My father is gone," Julian began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But we have won this battle, and we will carry on his legacy. We will rebuild Riverrun, and we will ensure that our kingdom remains strong." There was a moment of silence before one of the generals, a man named General Cedric, stepped forward. His face was weathered and his eyes tired, but there was a glimmer of respect in them as he addressed the new king. "Your Majesty," Cedric said, "your father was a great leader. But I see the same strength in you. We will follow you, as we followed him. Together, we will protect this kingdom." Julian nodded, though he could not fully shake the doubts that lingered in his heart. "Thank you, General. I will need all of you, more than ever, to guide us through the challenges ahead. Our victory here is just the beginning. Riverrun must rise again, stronger than before." As Julian spoke to his generals, he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The loss of his father weighed heavily on him, but he also knew that he could not afford to dwell on his grief. Riverrun needed him now, more than ever. The kingdom had suffered, but it had not been defeated. And as long as he was king, it would not be. That evening, Julian stood alone on the castle balcony, looking out over the kingdom that was now his to protect. The stars shone brightly in the sky, a silent reminder of the vastness of the world and the weight of his new responsibility. He could still feel the presence of his father with him, in every decision he made, in every step he took. His father's legacy lived on in him, and Julian would do everything in his power to honor it. The road ahead would be difficult. The wounds of war ran deep, and there was still much to be done. But Julian knew one thing for certain: he was ready. Ready to lead, ready to protect, and ready to carry on the legacy of the man who had taught him the true meaning of being a king. The days following the battle were a blur. Julian spent them in endless meetings with advisors, generals, and council members, all while the weight of the crown seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. His father's absence was palpable, a void that could not be filled. Still, Julian carried on, determined to protect his kingdom and honor his father's legacy. The castle was filled with preparations for the return to Riverrun. The soldiers had begun their march home, the wounded cared for by the kingdom's healers, while the celebrations of their victory remained subdued. Julian's mind was elsewhere, in the quiet moments when no one was watching. In those moments, he wondered if he was truly ready to be king. The council meetings often seemed endless, the topics ranging from the rebuilding of the kingdom to military strategy to discussions of foreign affairs. Julian's advisors spoke of peace treaties with neighboring kingdoms, of securing borders, and of re-establishing trade routes. But even as he nodded and made decisions, his thoughts often drifted back to the battlefield, to the soldiers who had given their lives, to his father, and to the legacy that now fell to him. On one particular day, as the sun began to set over the kingdom, Julian found himself alone in his father's study, surrounded by maps of the land, old books on governance, and letters from dignitaries. His father had spent so much time here, poring over these same maps, making decisions that affected the future of Riverrun. Julian felt a deep sadness as he ran his fingers over the worn edges of his father's writing desk. He had always admired the king's strength, but now, standing in his place, he was overwhelmed with the responsibility. The door opened quietly, and General Cedric entered the room, his expression serious but respectful. Julian straightened up, wiping away a tear that had escaped his eye. "Your Majesty," Cedric said softly, "I understand the weight you carry. I saw it in your eyes during the battle. But you are not alone. We are with you, every step of the way. Your father would have wanted you to lead, but he would also want you to trust in those around you." Julian looked at Cedric, feeling the warmth of his words, but still unable to shake the doubt that lingered in his mind. "I don't know if I'm ready, General. The kingdom is in shambles, and there is so much that needs to be done. How can I do it all?" Cedric stepped closer, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder. "You are ready, Your Majesty. You have your father's blood in your veins. But remember, a king does not rule alone. You have advisors, generals, and soldiers who will stand by you. Trust them as they trust you." Julian nodded, appreciating the counsel, but still uncertain. The weight of the crown was crushing, and the idea of taking his father's place in such turbulent times seemed impossible. "Tomorrow, we set out for Riverrun," Cedric continued. "We need to prepare the kingdom for reconstruction, both physically and emotionally. The people will look to you for guidance. They need to know that their king will not falter." Julian looked out the window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The kingdom was broken, but it was still his to protect. The weight of his father's legacy might be heavy, but it was a legacy worth carrying. His father had always believed in him, and now it was time for Julian to believe in himself. "You're right, General," Julian said, his voice steady. "Tomorrow, we begin the journey home. I will lead Riverrun, just as my father did. For him, and for the people of this kingdom." Cedric gave a nod of approval. "And we will follow you, Your Majesty. Always." With a final glance at his father's study, Julian stood tall, his resolve beginning to solidify. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but it was one he had to make. Riverrun had been through much, and now it was up to Julian to lead them into a new era. As he turned to leave the study, Julian felt a spark of hope ignite within him. He was not alone, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew that with the support of those around him, he could restore Riverrun to its former glory. His father's legacy would live on not just in the kingdom, but in the heart of every citizen who called it home. The journey back to Riverrun was long and arduous. The army, wounded yet victorious, moved at a steady pace through the dense forests and across the open plains. The once glorious roads of the kingdom now lay in ruin, much like the state of the land itself. Julian's mind remained heavy, but his resolve grew stronger with each passing day. As the procession neared the kingdom's borders, Julian could see the devastation firsthand. Villages had been burned, crops destroyed, and the people who had once lived in peace now lived in fear. The smoke from the ruined towns still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the price paid for the recent war. Julian's heart ached as he thought of the innocent lives lost, the families torn apart, and the land scarred by battle, but he would not let it remain this way. Riverrun had always been a place of prosperity, a beacon of hope for the people who lived there. His father had dedicated his life to protecting and nurturing it, and now it was his turn. The people needed him, and he would not let them down. When they finally reached the gates of Riverrun, Julian's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. The city had changed, though not in the way he had hoped. It felt quieter now, as if the very soul of the kingdom had been sapped by the war. But it was still Riverrun. It still had the heart and spirit that had made it great. And that was something Julian would fight to preserve. Julian quickly set to work, consulting with the kingdom's officials and military leaders. There were plans to rebuild, to restore the villages that had been destroyed, and to re-establish the trade routes that had once connected Riverrun to the outside world. But there was also a need to heal both the land and the people. The scars of war were not just physical, they were emotional, and Julian knew that would take time. That he spent his days traveling to the farthest reaches of the kingdom, speaking with the people, offering what comfort he could, and assuring them that the crown would stand beside them in their rebuilding. He met with the farmers who had lost everything, the craftsmen whose workshops had been burned to the ground, and the children who had been orphaned. Julian listened to their stories, shared in their grief, and promised them that their suffering would not be forgotten. And while Julian worked tirelessly, the advisors and generals worked just as hard behind the scenes. The kingdom's military, once a source of strength, was now weak from the losses suffered in battle. But Julian, ever the strategist, understood that they needed to build it back up, not just in numbers, but in morale. He authorized the creation of new training camps, ensuring that every soldier, from the youngest recruit to the seasoned veteran, was prepared for whatever the future held. It would take time, but the kingdom would rise again. One evening, after a long day of meetings and inspections, Julian found himself alone in the royal gardens, walking amidst the stillness of the evening. The cool air of the night brushed against his skin, and the sounds of the kingdom, of children laughing, of merchants calling out to customers, of the distant hum of everyday life, seemed to bring him a fleeting sense of peace. He stopped by a fountain, gazing at the water as it trickled down into the basin. His thoughts drifted back to the war, to his father, and to the responsibility that now lay squarely on his shoulders. The crown, once a symbol of pride and honor, felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. But he couldn't let that show. For the kingdom, for the people, he had to remain strong. "You look lost in thought, Your Majesty," a voice interrupted his reverie. Julian turned to see General Cedric approaching, his ever-steady presence a reminder of the loyalty and strength of the men who fought by his side. "Just thinking," Julian said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Wondering if I'm doing enough. The kingdom, it's broken. And I fear it may never be the same again." Cedric walked to his side, standing silently for a moment before speaking. "None of us will ever forget the scars of this war, Julian. But you are not alone in this. You've already done more than most would ever be capable of. And remember, the people of Riverrun have never known a king as determined as you. They look to you for guidance, and they know that you will bring this kingdom back to life." Julian nodded, grateful for the general's words, but still unsure of his ability to lead. "But can I bring it back? Can I make this kingdom thrive again?" Cedric placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "You already are. Every day you work, every decision you make, you are laying the foundation for a new era. You have the heart of a king, Julian. That is what this kingdom needs." The following months were a blur of effort, determination, and hard work. Julian oversaw the rebuilding of the kingdom, meeting with artisans, farmers, and traders to ensure that the heart of Riverrun would beat again. He worked tirelessly, sometimes pushing himself beyond his limits, but he always remembered what General Cedric had told him. He wasn't alone. Riverrun began to change. Slowly but surely, the people returned to their homes, the markets came alive again, and the land began to heal. Julian's leadership was proving effective, and for the first time since the war, hope began to spread throughout the kingdom. There were still challenges ahead, but the worst of it was over. And then, one day, as Julian stood atop the royal balcony overlooking the capital, he realized something. The kingdom was not just recovering, it was thriving. Riverrun had not just survived, it was stronger, more united, and more determined than ever before. He smiled, the weight of his responsibilities momentarily lifted. His father's legacy would live on, not just in the kingdom, but in the hearts of the people. Julian had done it. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like the true king of Riverrun. The sun was just beginning to rise over Riverrun, casting a golden hue across the kingdom. Julian stood on the balcony, watching as the light touched the stone walls of the castle, the gleaming spires of the city, and the faraway hills beyond. His kingdom was at peace, or so it seemed. But Julian knew better. Peace was always fragile, and threats could lurk in the shadows. As the days passed, a sense of unease began to creep into the court. Whispers of unrest in the neighboring regions began to surface, and rumors of a new, hidden enemy surfaced. Julian could not ignore them. Riverrun had been rebuilt, its people had returned to their homes, and life had started to feel normal again. But the war had taught him one lesson above all else: complacency was dangerous. Julian met with his most trusted advisors and generals in the war room that morning. General Cedric, his right-hand man, was there, along with Lady Miriam, the head of intelligence, and Sir Alistair, the kingdom's chief strategist. They had been discussing the possibility of an enemy, someone or something, lurking just beyond their borders. "We've received reports," Lady Miriam began, her tone grave. "There are signs of a conspiracy. An assassin's guild, known only as the Black Blade, has been seen in several neighboring regions. They specialize in killing high-ranking officials and have been hired by an unknown force to target you, Your Majesty." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. Assassins were no strangers to the royal family, but the idea of being hunted by such a mysterious and skilled group filled him with dread. "Do we have any leads?" Julian asked, his voice steady but concerned. Miriam nodded. "There have been sightings of Black Blade operatives near the borders of the Eastern Province. We believe they are trying to gain access to the castle. Then we will fortify the castle," Julian said firmly. "We cannot allow this to succeed." Over the next few days, the kingdom's defenses were heightened. Guards were placed at every strategic point, and the streets around the castle were closely monitored. Julian knew that the Black Blade was not an enemy that could be dealt with lightly. They were known for their ability to infiltrate even the most secure locations, and they worked with ruthless efficiency, but Julian was determined. He would not fall victim to this threat. The people of Riverrun had trusted him, and he would protect them at all costs. The days passed in tense silence. Every corner of the castle felt like a potential trap, every shadow a hiding place for an assassin. Julian slept fitfully, his mind racing with thoughts of his kingdom's safety and the looming threat. But he would not be intimidated. He would be ready. One evening, as Julian was walking through the castle's private gardens, his thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling in the bushes. His instincts immediately kicked in, and he reached for his sword, but before he could draw it, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her face partially hidden by a hood. She was tall, with striking features, and her movements were smooth and precise. Julian had seen her before. She was the one who had saved him months ago from the assassin's trap in the forest. "You," Julian said, his heart racing. "What are you doing here?" The woman lowered her hood, revealing her face fully. Her eyes were dark and intense, and there was an aura of mystery about her. "I've come to warn you, Your Majesty," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The Black Blade is already inside the castle." Julian's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? How?" "They've infiltrated the castle's staff," the woman explained. "I have learned of their plot. They plan to strike tonight, during the royal banquet. They will blend in with the guests and strike when you least expect it." Julian's mind raced. He knew that the banquet was a critical moment. Hundreds of nobles, diplomats, and guests would be in attendance. It would be the perfect opportunity for an assassin to slip through the cracks. "We need to act quickly," Julian said, his voice tight with urgency. "Gather the guards, and we will prepare for the worst." The woman nodded. "I will lead you to the hidden passageways. There is a way to confront them before they can strike." The night of the banquet arrived, and the castle was alive with activity. Music played in the halls, and guests milled about, their laughter echoing through the corridors. But Julian could not shake the feeling of unease that hung in the air. He knew that danger was imminent, and he would not allow himself to be caught off guard. The woman, whose name Julian had learned was Alina, led him through a series of hidden corridors beneath the castle. As they moved through the shadows, Julian could hear the muffled sounds of the celebration above, a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of their mission. They reached a small, dimly lit chamber where several guards were waiting. Alina motioned for Julian to stay back as she began to give orders, her voice barely a whisper. They would surround the banquet hall and take out any assassins before they had a chance to strike. As the banquet continued, Julian's heart pounded in his chest. He stood among his guests, his smile thin, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. It was a game of patience now. He would have to trust Alina and the guards to do their work. Then, as the clock struck midnight, chaos erupted. A sharp cry rang out from the far side of the hall. A nobleman fell to the ground, his throat slit open, and the guests screamed in panic. The assassins had made their move, but Julian was ready. Alina and the guards sprang into action, moving quickly and decisively through the chaos. They fought with precision, neutralizing the assassins one by one. Julian, with his sword drawn, moved through the crowd, his eyes searching for the leader of the Black Blade. He found him at the center of the hall, surrounded by the last of his men. "You won't leave this castle alive," Julian said, his voice cold as he faced the leader, a man cloaked in black armor. The assassin smiled, his eyes glinting with malice. "We've been paid well, Your Majesty. But you'll never stop us. There are always more of us." Julian's heart hardened. "Then we will fight until the last." The battle was fierce, but Julian, fueled by the protection of his kingdom, fought with unmatched determination. With a final, swift strike, he brought down the leader of the Black Blade, ending the threat once and for all. The castle was left in a state of chaos, but the assassins were defeated. Riverrun had survived yet another crisis, and Julian's reign was secured. As the blooded bodies were removed and the wounded tended to, Julian stood tall, his eyes filled with determination. He had faced the shadow of death, and yet he was still standing. Riverrun was safe, and with Alina at his side, they would rebuild once again. The night was long and filled with the sounds of quiet whispers as the wounded were tended to, and the castle's halls were cleaned of the remnants of the attack. Despite the chaos, Julian felt a strange calm settle over him. The danger had passed, and Riverrun was still intact. The threat of the Black Blade had been erased, for now. But Julian knew that in the world he inhabited, threats didn't always come from the obvious places. Alina had proven invaluable in the defense of the castle. Her knowledge of the enemy and her swift actions had saved countless lives. Julian had never felt more grateful for her presence. He had always been a king focused on the larger picture, but Alina was a reminder that it was the small details, the hidden corners, the quiet movements that often held the greatest power. As the hours passed, Julian returned to his chambers to find himself alone with his thoughts. The weight of the crown never truly left him, even in moments like these. The burden of keeping his kingdom safe, of being the protector of Riverrun, felt heavier with each passing day. But there was a resolve in Julian's heart, a belief that he could handle whatever challenge came his way. However, just as he was about to rest, a soft knock came at the door. He straightened up, wiping the fatigue from his face as he called out, "Enter." The door creaked open, and Alina stepped inside. Her face was tired, her eyes dark from the hours of battle and strain, but there was something else in her gaze, a quiet urgency. "Your Majesty, there's something you need to know," Alina said, her voice tight with concern. Julian sat up straighter, his heart quickening. "What is it?" "It's about the Black Blade," she began, closing the door behind her and stepping closer to him. "I found something after the attack. A letter, hidden beneath the leader's armor." Julian's brows furrowed as she handed him the letter. He took it from her and broke the seal, reading the contents quickly. The letter revealed something that sent a chill down his spine. There was more to the Black Blade than he had initially realized. The guild had been hired by someone inside his own court, someone he trusted. The letter named a figure in his inner circle who had been secretly collaborating with the assassins. "My lord, I believe there's a traitor among us," Alina said softly, watching Julian's reaction carefully. Julian's heart sank. He had always known that betrayal was a constant companion in leadership, but to have someone so close to him involved with the enemy, it was unimaginable. He looked at Alina, meeting her eyes with a newfound determination. "We need to find out who did this," Julian said, his voice low. "And we need to stop them before they can do any more damage." The investigation began immediately. Julian ordered the most trusted members of his council to search for any signs of betrayal within the court. Whispers and suspicions began to circulate, but no one was certain. Every meeting was shadowed by suspicion, and every person in the royal court became a suspect. It was a tense atmosphere, where no one was safe from the growing paranoia. As the days passed, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that the traitor was someone closer than he had thought. The circle around him had always seemed tight, but now it seemed full of cracks and hidden dangers. Then came a breakthrough. Lady Miriam, who had been investigating the council, found evidence of a secret meeting between one of the royal advisors and a member of the Black Blade. The advisor's name was Lord Victor, a man who had served as one of Julian's closest allies for years. Julian was stunned. He had known Lord Victor well, had even relied on him during the darkest times of the war. To think that he had been deceiving him all along was beyond belief. Julian wasted no time. He summoned Lord Victor to the royal chambers, his mind already made up. The betrayal cut deep, but he would not show weakness. Riverrun needed its king to be strong, unwavering in the face of treachery. Lord Victor arrived, his demeanor calm and composed, but Julian could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. The man knew the truth had been uncovered. "Your Majesty," Lord Victor greeted, bowing low. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Julian's voice was cold as he spoke. "You are, Victor. You've been conspiring with the Black Blade. I know everything." Lord Victor's face remained unchanged, though his hands clenched slightly at his sides. "I don't know what you mean, my king." "Don't lie to me," Julian said firmly, stepping closer. "I have the letter. I know about the meetings. You've betrayed everything I've worked for." The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Lord Victor's composure cracked, and a smirk appeared on his face. "You think you can stop it, Julian? You're too weak. The Black Blade is unstoppable. And now, so is I." Before Julian could react, Lord Victor drew a dagger, but it was too late. Alina, ever watchful, had been waiting for this moment. She was on him before he could make another move, disarming him in an instant. "Your Majesty, he's not going anywhere," Alina said, her voice as sharp as her sword. Julian stared at Lord Victor with disgust. "You've been hiding in the shadows, plotting, while I trusted you with everything. Your treachery ends today." With that, the guards took Lord Victor away, his plans foiled and his fate sealed. Julian knew that this event had shaken his court to its core. The wound of betrayal would take time to heal, but Riverrun had survived it. With Alina by his side, he had uncovered the traitor, and justice had been served that night. As Julian stood in his chambers once more, gazing out over the city, he felt a deep sense of resolve. He had learned that power came with immense responsibility, and that responsibility was not always about ruling, it was about protecting. And that protection would always come first, no matter the cost. The kingdom was safe, for now. And with Alina at his side, Julian was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following Lord Victor's betrayal were filled with reflection and resolution. Julian had expected anger and a deep sense of betrayal, and while both were present, they were not as overpowering as he had imagined. Instead, there was a quiet determination that burned inside him, a sense that he had learned something important, not just about the people around him, but about himself. Alina continued to be a pillar of strength, never wavering in her loyalty and always ready to act when called upon. Julian found himself relying on her more than ever, not just for her skills in battle, but for her wisdom, her ability to think through the problems that seemed to overwhelm him. Together, they navigated the murky waters of politics, ensuring that Riverrun was safe from further threats and that the kingdom's reputation remained strong. But there was something else that lingered in Julian's mind, something that had begun to take shape during the darkest days of the war, when everything seemed lost. The question of what kind of king he wanted to be. What did it mean to rule justly, to lead with strength but also with compassion? His father's legacy had taught him the importance of strategy and might, but Julian had come to understand that the true power of a king lay not in the strength of his armies or the wealth of his lands, but in the hearts of his people. If they did not trust him, if they did not believe in his vision for the future, then all the power in the world would be meaningless. The journey ahead would not be easy. Riverrun, though victorious, had been scarred by the recent events. The political landscape was shifting, alliances were in flux, and the kingdom's enemies, though weakened, were not gone. Julian knew that he had to secure his throne, but more than that, he had to secure the future of his people. It was a heavy burden, but one that he had come to accept. One morning, Julian called for a council meeting. As he sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his most trusted advisors, he looked around the room with a sense of purpose. His eyes landed on Alina, who had become a close confidant and, in many ways, a symbol of the strength of their kingdom. "Today marks the beginning of a new era for Riverrun," Julian said, his voice strong and commanding. "We have faced betrayal and darkness, but we have emerged stronger. Our kingdom is more than just its walls, its armies, or its wealth. Our true strength lies in the people we serve, the people who look to us for guidance and protection. It is time we shift our focus. We must rebuild not just our defenses, but our hearts." The room fell silent as Julian's words sunk in. His advisors exchanged glances, each of them aware of the weight of what he was saying. "We must ensure that the lands we've fought so hard to protect are prosperous, that the people's voices are heard, and that we create a future that is worthy of the sacrifices that have been made. This will be our legacy," he continued, his eyes now resting on Alina. "And Alina, you will be at my side, as always. Together, we will guide Riverrun into this new chapter." Alina nodded, her eyes meeting Julian's with unwavering trust. She had always believed in him, but now, more than ever, she saw the man he was becoming. A king, not just by title, but by the choices he made every day. The weeks turned into months, and Julian's vision began to take shape. He traveled across Riverrun, meeting with the people and hearing their concerns. He worked with his advisors to ensure that the economy was rebuilt, that education and trade flourished, and that the foundations of a just and prosperous society were laid. His reign, though still young, had already begun to reflect the ideals he had set for himself: strength tempered by compassion, power wielded with fairness, and a commitment to the people above all else. And then, one day, as Julian stood at the edge of the great city of Riverrun, watching the sun set over the horizon, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Alina standing beside him, her eyes as steady as ever. "You've done it, Julian," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. Together, they stood in silence, watching as the light of the setting sun bathed the kingdom in a golden glow. The road ahead was long, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges to face. But in that moment, Julian knew that they were ready. They had not only survived the darkness, they had emerged from it stronger, united, and ready to build a future that would stand the test of time. And so, King Julian and Alina continued to rule Riverrun, a kingdom once on the brink of destruction, now flourishing under their leadership. Their story was one of resilience, of overcoming betrayal and adversity, and ultimately, of creating a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Months had passed since the war had ended, and Riverrun was flourishing under the wise and compassionate rule of King Julian. The wounds of the past were slowly healing, and with the guidance of his most trusted advisor, Alina, the kingdom was becoming a beacon of prosperity. Julian and Alina had grown inseparable, their bond deepening with each passing day. Their connection, forged in the fires of battle and cemented through shared ideals, had become a force that no one could break. The people of Riverrun looked to their king and his queen with admiration and respect. Julian's leadership was steadfast, and Alina's counsel had proven invaluable. The kingdom was rebuilding, not just physically, but emotionally, as hope once again flourished in the hearts of the people. But amidst the joy and the achievements, Alina often found herself lost in her thoughts. Late at night, when the palace was quiet, she would sit by the window, gazing out at the stars, remembering her father, the humble forester who had once guided her with wisdom and strength. She had not forgotten the lessons he had taught her, the bond they had shared before his death in the battle point. One evening, after a long day of matters of the court, Alina retired to her chambers. She had grown tired, both physically and emotionally, yet something called to her in the quiet of the night. As she drifted into sleep, her mind wandered into a dream. In her dream, Alina found herself standing in the middle of a dense forest, the trees towering above her, their leaves whispering in the wind. The air was cool, and the scent of pine and earth filled her lungs. As she walked deeper into the forest, she saw a familiar figure ahead, her father. He stood with his back to her, his rugged clothes blending with the natural world. She called out to him, her voice trembling. "Father!" He turned slowly, his eyes warm with the same wisdom she had always known. He smiled softly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "Alina," he said in his deep, steady voice, "you've done well. You've become the woman I always knew you could be." "But," Alina began, her voice catching in her throat, "how can I continue without you? I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry on the way you did." Her father's smile deepened, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You are stronger than you think, my daughter. The strength you seek is not in the battles you fight or the victories you claim. It's in your heart, in your ability to love and lead, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I see the leader in you, Alina. You will guide this kingdom with the same wisdom and compassion I taught you. Your journey is just beginning." Alina's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "I miss you, Father. So much." "I know," he said quietly, "but I am always with you, in the whisper of the trees, in the rustle of the leaves. You carry me with you in everything you do. And now, you must carry the future of Riverrun with the same love and courage. You will not fail." Before she could respond, the image of her father began to fade, and the forest around her shifted, dissolving into light. Her father's voice echoed in her ears as the dream slowly slipped away. Alina awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the window. She sat up in bed, her mind racing. She could still hear her father's words, as though they were etched in her soul. Her gaze turned to the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. She rose from the bed and walked to the window, her heart filled with a newfound clarity. In her father's dream, She had found the strength she had been searching for all along. It was not in the sword she had wielded or the battles she had fought, but in her heart, in the love she had for her people, and in the leadership that she and Julian now shared. Alina smiled softly to herself. She knew that the journey ahead would not always be easy, but she was ready. With Julian by her side, and with her father's spirit within her, there was no challenge they could not overcome. As she turned to leave her chamber, she found Julian standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with concern. "Alina," he asked softly, "are you all right?" She nodded, her heart at peace. "I'm more than all right, Julian. I'm ready. Together, we will guide Riverrun to even greater heights." And with that, the two of them walked forward into the future, hand in hand, united not only by their love but by the shared responsibility they carried for their kingdom. It was a new beginning for them both, a new chapter that would be written with courage, wisdom, and love. The days in Riverrun seemed to flow with a quiet serenity, but beneath the surface, there were whispers of a future yet to unfold. Julian and Alina's reign was still young, and the people were hopeful, their eyes fixed on the horizon, expecting great things. Yet, as they stood at the edge of a new era, neither Julian nor Alina could shake the feeling that their journey was far from complete. There were still shadows lingering beyond the peaceful borders of their kingdom, and some challenges, though unseen, would soon test them in ways they could not yet understand. One evening, as Julian sat by the great hearth in the palace, contemplating the path ahead, a messenger arrived. His face was drawn with urgency. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing low, "there are reports of strange happenings near the borders. Movements we cannot explain, whispers of old powers awakening in the east." Julian stood, his brow furrowed. "What sort of powers?" "We don't know yet, my king," the messenger replied, his voice tense. "But it seems that the world outside Riverrun is changing. Forces we thought long gone are stirring once more. I fear it may be something ancient." Alina, who had been silently observing, exchanged a look with Julian. The weight of the messenger's words hung heavily between them. Riverrun had been peaceful for so long, but now the winds of change were blowing, and they both felt that they stood at the threshold of something far larger than they could have imagined. The room grew quiet as the tension thickened, and for the first time in months, Alina felt a flicker of uncertainty. Was this the end of their peace, or the beginning of something more? The dawn of a new adventure, a new challenge perhaps? Neither of them knew, but one thing was clear: whatever was coming, they would face it together. As Julian turned to look out over the palace gardens, Alina's thoughts wandered back to the dream of her father. She could hear his voice again, urging her to be strong, to lead with wisdom. But now, as she looked out into the darkening sky, she knew that even the wisest rulers were not immune to the unknown. A storm was brewing, and they would have to meet it head-on. Would they rise to the challenge, or would this be a chapter in Riverrun's history they would wish to forget? As the wind howled outside, it was clear that the story of King Julian and Queen Alina was far from over. Julian awoke to a heavy silence, the room around him dark except for the faint glow of early morning light creeping through the curtains. He sat up slowly, his thoughts still hazy from the dreams that had haunted him throughout the night. The vision of his father, standing strong in the forest, his deep voice calling out through the trees, echoed in Julian's mind. As he rose from his bed, the weight of the crown seemed heavier than ever. He had dreamed of Alina's father, the man who had saved him from the assassin's blow. The forest, the trees, and the memories from their past together were vivid, as if they were trying to communicate something important. The memories of that moment, when Alina had saved him, still felt like a dream. The world felt fragile now, as if everything was teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Julian stepped out onto the balcony, feeling the cool morning breeze on his skin. His eyes scanned the horizon, but all he could see was the quiet expanse of the kingdom he ruled. His thoughts wandered back to the dream. Could it have been a message from his father? He needed to understand what it meant before it was too late. Julian clenched his fists, determination in his heart. He would not fail his kingdom. He would not fail Alina. The air felt different today, as if something was brewing in the distance. Julian could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of him, the burden of leadership pressing harder now than ever before. But he was ready, or so he hoped. Alina appeared in the doorway, her expression soft but serious. "Julian, what's wrong?" she asked gently, her eyes filled with concern. Julian turned to face her, his heart heavy with emotions he could not yet express. "I saw him again," Julian whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Alina stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm, offering him her strength. "Your father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Julian nodded, the memory still fresh in his mind. "He spoke to me in the dream. But there was something in it, something I can't understand yet. It's as if he was telling me something important, something that might change everything for us." Alina took a deep breath and held his gaze. "Maybe it's time we found out what it means. Together," she said firmly, her confidence reassuring him. The two of them stood there, looking out over the kingdom they had fought so hard to protect, knowing that their journey was far from over. But in that moment, they both understood one thing. They would face whatever came next, side by side, ready to uncover the truth that lay hidden in the shadows. And so, Julian and Alina's journey continued, not knowing what awaited them, but knowing they had each other, and that was all that mattered. As the days passed, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. A storm on the horizon, something he couldn't yet see but could feel in his bones. The kingdom felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, something to change. Alina remained by his side, steady and strong, a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. Her unwavering support gave him strength, even when his doubts threatened to overwhelm him. Together, they started making plans for the future, discussing every possible outcome, every possible path that their kingdom could take. But the weight of the dream, the cryptic message from his father, lingered in Julian's mind. Was it a warning? A sign? He couldn't be sure, but he couldn't ignore it either. His father had always been a man of action, a man who spoke with his deeds, not just words. Julian had to honor that legacy, had to carry it forward. One evening, as the sun set behind the castle, Julian and Alina walked along the walls, looking over the vast lands that stretched beyond the kingdom. Julian's mind was heavy, but his heart was full of determination. He knew the battle ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. "I think we're ready," Alina said, her voice soft but resolute. Julian turned to look at her, seeing the confidence in her eyes, the same confidence she had always had in him. "Ready for what?" Julian asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. "Ready to face whatever comes next," Alina replied, her words strong and true. "Together, we can handle anything." Julian nodded, the weight on his shoulders a little less heavy with Alina's support. He took a deep breath, letting the wind carry away some of his worries. In this moment, Julian knew that the journey would be long and the path unclear, but with Alina by his side, he felt ready to face anything that lay ahead. They continued their walk, side by side, their footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. The kingdom around them was peaceful, the calm before the storm, but Julian knew that peace was always temporary. In the days that followed, Julian gathered his advisors, prepared his army, and set the wheels of change in motion. His father's dream had shown him that there were more challenges to come, and he couldn't afford to be unprepared. The kingdom needed him to be strong, to lead them through whatever trials awaited them. Alina was with him every step of the way, her strength and wisdom guiding him through the most difficult decisions. And though Julian's heart was heavy with the weight of his father's legacy, he knew that he was ready to take up the mantle, to become the king the kingdom needed. As the days turned into weeks, the winds of change began to blow across the kingdom. Julian spent his nights in the war room, studying maps and strategies, preparing his soldiers for what lay ahead. Alina, ever watchful, would sit beside him, offering words of encouragement when the weight of the decisions became too much. The dream he had of his father, that strange, cryptic message, still haunted him. Was it a prophecy? A warning? Julian couldn't say, but one thing was clear: the peace he had fought so hard to protect would soon be tested. He knew that no matter how prepared they were, the true test would be in the battle itself. Julian had always admired his father's strength, his unwavering belief in the people and the land they ruled. But now, the mantle of leadership had fallen to him, and he felt the pressure more than ever. There were moments when he doubted his ability, when the weight of the crown seemed unbearable, but Alina's unwavering belief in him kept him going. Her confidence reminded him of the strength he carried within, the same strength that had seen his kingdom through the darkest of times. The day finally arrived when Julian had to face the armies that threatened the kingdom's borders. His army stood ready, their weapons polished, their hearts prepared for the battle that would shape their future. The kingdom had never been so united, so determined, but Julian knew the real test would be in the heat of battle. Alina, though not a soldier, stood by his side, her presence a constant reassurance. She had always been his rock, but now she had become the kingdom's protector as well. The people of the kingdom had learned to trust in her, to look to her for guidance and wisdom. As Julian looked out over the horizon, he could see the enemy's forces assembling in the distance. It was time to defend the land he had promised to protect, time to face the unknown forces that threatened everything they held dear. The air was thick with tension as Julian's army lined up in formation, each soldier standing tall, ready to defend their kingdom. Julian could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, but he didn't waver. His people believed in him, and he would not let them down. The battle that loomed ahead would be one for the history books, but it was also a battle for survival. Alina stood beside him, her presence a calm amidst the storm. She had taken her place among the advisors, helping strategize, offering her wisdom when Julian needed it most. The bond they shared was undeniable, and in these critical moments, it became even clearer how much they had come to depend on each other. "Ready yourself, my king," one of the generals said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy in the air. Julian nodded, gathering his courage before turning to face his army. His heart raced, but his resolve was unwavering. The battle horn sounded, and the earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble as the enemy forces began to advance. The sky was dark, clouds swirling as if the heavens themselves were preparing for the conflict. The roar of the enemy's war cries filled the air, a sound that would have frightened many, but Julian stood firm. Alina watched from a distance, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this battle could change everything, and she knew the risks better than anyone. But she also knew that Julian was no ordinary king. He had the strength of his father in him, the same strength that had been passed down through generations. The clash of swords echoed across the battlefield as Julian led his army into the fray. His soldiers fought with fierce determination, their trust in their king unshakable. Julian fought at the forefront, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his heart and mind focused on the task at hand. 4 hours, the battle raged on, neither side giving ground. Julian's arm ached from swinging his sword, but he pressed on, knowing that his kingdom's fate rested on this moment. With every strike, every movement, Julian could feel his resolve harden, his fear and doubt fading away. As the sun began to set, Julian saw the enemy's forces start to retreat. His army, though blooded and tired, had managed to hold their ground, and with one final push, they forced the enemy to surrender. Julian's heart swelled with relief, but he knew this victory came at a cost. The battlefield was littered with fallen soldiers, both from his kingdom and the enemy's forces. Julian knelt beside the bodies of his fallen comrades, his heart heavy with grief. It was a victory, yes, but it was also a reminder of the harsh reality of war, its cost, its pain, and its irreversible toll on both sides. The battlefield was silent now, save for the sound of soldiers tending to the wounded, their faces grim with exhaustion and sorrow. Julian stood at the edge of the field, his eyes scanning the aftermath of the conflict. The once green grass was now stained with blood, the scent of smoke and iron lingering in the air. His mind was clouded with thoughts of the lives lost, both from his own army and the enemy forces. Victory, he realized, always came with a price. He had won the battle, but the cost of war weighed heavily on his shoulders. The cries of the wounded echoed in his ears, and each face he passed seemed to remind him of what they had endured to achieve this victory. Julian had always believed in the cause, in the defense of his kingdom, but as he walked through the remnants of battle, he couldn't help but wonder if there was another way, a way to protect his people without so much bloodshed. Alina appeared beside him, her face pale from the tension of the day. She had been at the back of the battlefield, coordinating the medical teams, making sure the wounded were tended to. Her hands were stained with blood, but it was not her own. Julian's heart ached seeing her like this, so strong yet carrying the weight of the battlefield on her shoulders. "We did it," she said softly, though there was no joy in her voice. "But at what cost?" Julian didn't answer at first. He couldn't. The words felt hollow, and nothing he said could change the reality before him. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "We've won, Alina," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll carry this weight with me, always." She squeezed his hand gently, her eyes meeting his with a look of understanding. They both knew that the battle was just one chapter in a much larger story. The war was not over. The enemy may have been defeated, but other challenges lay ahead. Julian couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger struggle. Later that evening, Julian stood alone in his chamber, looking out over the kingdom. The moonlight bathed the land in a soft glow, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. The war was over, for now, and his people could rest. But Julian knew deep down that peace was fleeting. His father's dream of a united kingdom, one that would stand strong in the face of any enemy, was far from complete. As he turned to leave the room, a servant entered, a letter in hand. "From King Julian's advisors," she said. Julian took the letter, his curiosity piqued. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. "The enemy is not as defeated as we thought," the letter read. "Reports indicate that remnants of their forces are regrouping in the mountains, preparing for another assault." Julian's heart sank. The war was not over. His victory was short-lived, and the kingdom would once again be thrust into the fires of battle. Julian paced the war room, his mind racing. The news of the enemy's regrouping sent a chill through him. He had hoped for a chance to rebuild, to help his people recover from the scars of war. But now, it seemed that another conflict loomed on the horizon, one that could threaten everything they had fought for. Alina was by his side, as always, her eyes scanning the map spread out before them. The enemy forces were regrouping in the mountains, a difficult terrain to navigate, but not impossible. Julian knew that they would have to move quickly if they were to prevent the enemy from launching another attack. "We need to act now," Julian said, his voice steady. "We can't afford to wait for them to come to us. We need to take the fight to them." Alina nodded, her expression serious. "I agree. We can't let them regroup and strengthen their forces. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to stop them." Julian turned to his generals, his mind already working on the strategy. "We'll move out at dawn. We'll take the mountain pass and attack them before they have a chance to gather their forces. We can't afford a drawn-out battle. This must end now." The room fell silent as the generals processed the plan. It was a bold move, one that could end the conflict once and for all, or it could lead to disaster. But Julian knew there was no other choice. His kingdom needed him, and he would not falter now. Later that night, Julian sat with Alina, discussing the next steps. "This is it," he said softly. "This could be the final battle." Alina met his gaze, her eyes full of determination. "You're ready, Julian. You've always been ready for this." Julian smiled faintly. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm going to fight with everything I have." As dawn broke, the kingdom's army set out toward the mountains. Julian led the charge, his heart heavy with the weight of the decisions ahead. This battle would determine the future of his kingdom, and he couldn't afford to fail. The journey to the mountains was treacherous, the terrain difficult to navigate. But Julian and his army pressed on, their determination unwavering. As they neared the enemy's stronghold, Julian could feel the tension in the air. The final battle was upon them, and the fate of the kingdom rested on their shoulders. The sun was just beginning to rise as Julian and his army approached the foot of the mountain pass. The air was crisp and biting, but the soldiers were determined, their faces set with purpose. Each step brought them closer to the enemy, and Julian could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the battle that would determine the future of his kingdom. If they failed, everything they had fought for would be lost. Alina stood beside him, her eyes scanning the distant peaks. "We can't afford to underestimate them," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "They've been preparing for this, and they're likely waiting for us." Julian nodded. "We know the terrain, and we know their tactics. But we also have the advantage of surprise. If we strike hard and fast, we can catch them off guard." The army moved silently through the mountains, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The only sounds were the occasional whisper of the wind and the distant calls of the hawks that circled overhead. As they climbed higher, Julian's thoughts turned to his people. This battle was not just for him, it was for everyone in his kingdom. He couldn't afford to let them down. At the top of the mountain pass, they finally saw the enemy encampment in the distance. It was heavily fortified, but Julian had already devised a plan. They would split into two groups, one to attack the front gates, and the other to scale the cliffs on the side and ambush the enemy from behind. If they could take them by surprise, they might stand a chance of winning. "Get ready," Julian said to his commanders. "We move in 5 minutes." No hesitation. His heart pounded in his chest as they prepared for the assault. He could hear the sound of his soldiers' armor shifting, their weapons being drawn. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. Julian took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew there was no turning back. As the signal was given, the army surged forward, charging down the mountain pass with a roar that echoed through the cliffs. The enemy forces, caught off guard, scrambled to defend their position. The sound of clashing swords and cries of battle filled the air as Julian and his men fought their way toward the enemy's stronghold. The battle raged for hours, the enemy putting up a fierce resistance. But Julian's forces had the advantage of surprise, and slowly, they began to push the enemy back. The sound of the battle grew louder, and Julian felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His body ached with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The fight had to be on. As the sun began to set, the tide of battle began to turn in Julian's favor. The enemy's forces were retreating, but they were not giving up without a fight. Julian's heart raced as he pressed on, determined to finish what they had started. The enemy's leader, a man known only as Varek, was still at the heart of the stronghold, and Julian knew that defeating him was the key to ending the war. Julian and his most trusted soldiers pushed forward, cutting through the last of the enemy's defenses. The gates to the stronghold were finally breached, and they charged into the heart of the enemy camp. Varek's personal guard was waiting for them, but Julian was ready. He had trained for this moment, and he would not let anything stand in his way. Varek appeared at the top of the stairs, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You think you can defeat me?" he sneered. "I've spent years building this empire, and you, a mere boy, think you can end it all?" Julian raised his sword, his eyes locked on the enemy leader. "Your empire is built on blood and suffering," he said coldly. "It ends today." With a battle cry, Julian charged up the stairs, his sword raised high. The two men met in the center of the courtyard, their swords clashing with a deafening ring. The fight was fierce, but Julian was fueled by years of pain and loss, and he fought with a determination that Varek could not match. With a final, powerful strike, Julian drove his sword into Varek's chest, ending the fight once and for all. The enemy leader collapsed to the ground, his blood staining the stones beneath him. Julian stood over him, panting, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "It's over," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse. As the battle came to a close, Julian's army secured the stronghold. The enemy forces had been defeated, and the war was finally over. But Julian's victory felt hollow. The cost of the war, the lives lost, and the destruction wrought upon his kingdom weighed heavily on him. He had won, but at what cost? Julian returned to his kingdom a hero, but the victory felt bittersweet. His people hailed him as a savior, and the celebrations lasted for days, but in the quiet moments, he could feel the weight of the war's aftermath pressing down on him. The fields that had once been lush and green were now scarred, the villages reduced to rubble. There was no true celebration, only a fragile sense of relief. Alina stood by his side, as always, offering him support. "You did what you had to do," she said gently, her eyes filled with compassion. "You saved your people, Julian. The war is over, and now it's time to rebuild." Julian nodded, but the burden of leadership still hung heavily on him. "The people are celebrating, but they don't understand what it cost," he said softly. "We may have won the war, but the scars will remain. It's going to take time to heal. Alina placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do it alone. We're in this together, remember? Her words were a comfort, but Julian still felt the weight of his responsibility. He knew that his kingdom would need him more than ever in the days to come. There was much to rebuild and many wounds to heal, but he was determined to lead his people into a new era of peace. As Julian and Alina stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom, they both knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But with each other's support, they would face whatever came their way, together, and so, the new era began, with Julian and Alina at its helm. The kingdom would rise from the ashes of war, stronger than before, and under their rule, peace would reign. The future was uncertain, but Julian knew one thing for sure: he would never stop fighting for his people, no matter the cost. Alina's father, Roderick, lived a simple life as a woodcutter in the dense forests of the kingdom. He had always been a quiet man, content with his role as a protector of the forest and its creatures. He spent his days chopping wood and gathering resources for the people of the nearby villages. Though his life was humble, Roderick was a man of great integrity and strength. His small cottage was nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by towering trees, which he had planted himself. Roderick's love for nature went beyond just harvesting wood. He understood the balance of the forest and treated the land with respect. He often spoke to Alina about the deep connection he felt with the earth, explaining that every tree had a spirit and that the forest was a living, breathing entity. Alina grew up learning the ways of the forest from him, understanding how to live in harmony with nature. While many saw him as just a simple woodsman, Roderick had been a man of great influence in his community. He had a reputation for wisdom, and people from neighboring villages would often seek his advice on matters of the land and even on matters of life. Though he never sought fame, his reputation spread, and even the king had come to respect his knowledge of the forests and its resources. It was no surprise that, when Alina married King Julian, Roderick became an important advisor to the kingdom in matters related to nature and the environment. The peace that Julian had worked so hard to build was shattered when a neighboring kingdom, Doria, suddenly declared war on the kingdom of Julian. The reason for the war was a dispute over a border territory that had long been disputed but never fully resolved. Doria's king, King Malcor, had been looking for an excuse to expand his land, and Julian's peaceful reign had become a target. The declaration of war came as a shock. Julian had worked tirelessly to maintain peace and prosperity in his kingdom, but now, with tensions rising, the threat of war loomed. Malcor's armies, massive and ruthless, marched toward the borders of Julian's kingdom with overwhelming force. Julian immediately gathered his council and prepared for a defense. Despite the peace-loving nature of the kingdom, the people rallied behind their king. Julian knew this was not just a fight for land, but for the future of his people and his reign. Alina, though worried for her husband, stood by his side, offering strength and support. The war that was supposed to have been avoided had now come to their doorstep. As war loomed, Julian knew that he had to give his kingdom every advantage possible. In a bid to protect his people, Julian's engineers and scholars were called upon to create a weapon capable of turning the tide of battle. After weeks of tireless work, a revolutionary weapon was invented, a massive cannon capable of launching large projectiles over great distances. The war cannon was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a technological marvel, crafted with iron and brass, and capable of dealing devastating damage to the enemy. Julian knew that this weapon would be crucial in the coming battles, and he ordered a series of competitions to test the cannon's accuracy and strength. The competitions were held in the kingdom's largest training ground, where the best engineers, soldiers, and scholars competed to improve and refine the cannon. Alina, though not a participant in the competition, watched with fascination as the cannon was tested. She knew that this invention would change the course of the war. It was a new kind of weapon, and Julian's kingdom would be the first to wield it. As the war preparations continued, Julian recognized that in order to secure victory, his kingdom would need to strengthen its naval forces. The neighboring kingdom of Doria had a powerful navy, and Julian's kingdom could not afford to be outmatched on the seas. Julian ordered the construction of a large fleet of ships, each one designed for both defense and offense. The naval fleet would be a crucial part of their strategy. The people of the kingdom were eager to contribute to the cause, and soon the shipyards were bustling with activity. Men and women worked tirelessly, building sturdy ships with advanced techniques and materials. With the naval fleet taking shape, Julian could see the power of the sea as a force to be reckoned with. The ships were larger and more durable than any that Doria had, and they were equipped with the same cannons that had been so effective on land. Julian knew that with his navy and the war cannon, he now had a fighting chance against Doria's overwhelming forces. The day of battle finally arrived, and Julian found himself torn between the love for his kingdom and the duty he had to protect it. As he prepared for war, he spent his final moments with Alina, who had become a pillar of strength for him throughout the war. Her presence gave him the courage to face what lay ahead. Though Julian knew the war would be difficult, he was ready. He understood that this was a fight for the future of his people, and he was willing to risk everything for them. Alina, too, stood strong, though she feared for her husband's safety. She reminded him that no matter what happened, their love for each other would remain, and the kingdom would endure. The armies gathered, the warships set sail, and the cannons were loaded. The kingdom of Julian was ready for war, and the fate of the kingdom rested on the shoulders of its king. The war raged on for weeks, but Julian's forces, bolstered by the powerful cannons and the newly formed navy, began to gain ground. Doria's forces were strong, but the kingdom of Julian was fighting with the full strength of its people. Julian led his forces with a determination that inspired his men. The war cannon proved to be a game-changer, breaking through Doria's defenses and allowing Julian's forces to gain significant territory. On the seas, the naval fleet proved to be just as effective, sinking enemy ships and cutting off supply lines. The final battle took place near the border, where Julian's forces fought with everything they had. The fight was brutal, but with the help of the war cannon and the naval fleet, Julian's forces eventually prevailed. Doria was forced to retreat, and the kingdom of Julian emerged victorious. After the war, Julian returned to his kingdom, victorious but weary. The people celebrated the defeat of Doria, but Julian knew that the work of rebuilding was just beginning. As he and Alina returned to the castle, they were greeted with cheers from their people. The time had come to make a decision. Should they remain in the current castle, or should they move to a new palace? The people of the kingdom were divided on the matter, and Julian called for a vote to decide the future of the royal family. The vote was held in the grand hall of the castle, with citizens and nobles alike casting their ballots. After much discussion and debate, the decision was made. The royal family would move to a new palace in the newly conquered lands. The kingdom had grown, and the new palace would symbolize the strength and unity of the people. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor of moving to the new palace. The royal family was eager to begin this new chapter, and the people were excited about the prospects of living in the new lands. With the new palace constructed, Julian and Alina moved into their new home, ready to begin rebuilding and expanding their kingdom. As they settled into their new life, the kingdom of Julian entered a period of peace and prosperity. Julian's reign continued to bring stability and growth, and Alina stood by his side, offering wisdom and support. Together, they ruled the kingdom, knowing that their love and dedication to their people would ensure that their legacy would live on for generations to come. With the victory over Doria and the decision to relocate the royal family to the newly conquered lands, Julian knew that it was time to focus on securing the future of the kingdom, beyond the walls of the new palace. The land, though rich in potential, was still untapped, and Julian's vision for the kingdom stretched far beyond what the eyes could see. The key to his dreams of prosperity lay in the land's hidden resources, its mines. The newly conquered territory was rich in minerals, gold, silver, copper, iron, and rare gems, all buried deep within the earth. Julian understood that these resources could not only fuel the kingdom's economy but could also provide the power necessary to ensure the kingdom's defense and future growth. He was determined to harness this wealth for the greater good of his people, ensuring that no foreign power could threaten them again. Alina, as ever, stood beside him as they walked through the kingdom's rugged terrain, surveying the vast forests and mountains. The land, though beautiful, was harsh and unforgiving. It would take time, effort, and great investment to build the infrastructure that would bring these riches to the surface. The work ahead was monumental, but Julian was undeterred. He had fought for his kingdom's future, and now he would work for it. The first order of business was to establish the foundation of the mining operations. Julian called upon the kingdom's finest engineers, architects, and laborists to begin planning and constructing the necessary infrastructure for the extraction of the minerals. Roads needed to be built to reach the distant mountains and mines, while rail systems and mining carts had to be designed to transport materials quickly and efficiently. The challenge was immense, but Julian's engineers were some of the most skilled in the world, and they rose to the occasion. Work began in the heart of the kingdom's new territories, where the most promising mines were located. Julian had ordered the construction of a fortified mining town near the mountains, where workers, soldiers, and engineers would live. This would serve as the base for all mining operations, where resources would be gathered, sorted, and sent back to the kingdom for further processing. The town was designed with care, with large storage facilities, workspaces, and barracks for the workers and soldiers who would oversee the operation. The town was to be self-sufficient, with its own food supply grown in small farms surrounding it. It also had a large training center, where workers could learn the skills necessary for operating the mines and maintaining the machinery. The goal was not just to exploit the land for resources, but to create a thriving community of workers who could benefit from their labor and live in decent conditions. Julian was committed to ensuring that the workers who toiled in the mines were treated fairly and that they had access to everything they needed to live healthy, safe lives. Meanwhile, Alina worked with the kingdom's officials to establish the policies and guidelines that would govern the mining operations. The royal couple wanted to ensure that the land was not exploited at the expense of future generations. Sustainable practices were key to their vision for the kingdom's prosperity. They implemented strict environmental guidelines, ensuring that the mining operations would not damage the surrounding ecosystems or pollute the rivers and streams. Julian also ordered the planting of trees and other vegetation in the areas surrounding the mines to replace what was taken, ensuring that the land could regenerate. The creation of these mining operations was not without its challenges. The harsh terrain posed difficulties for transportation and construction, and the workers had to contend with extreme weather conditions. Some mines were located in dangerous, inaccessible places, requiring innovative techniques to extract the minerals. Julian's engineers devised advanced drilling and extraction methods, using a combination of new machinery and old-fashioned labor to get the job done. As the mining infrastructure began to take shape, Julian turned his attention to the processing plants. He understood that extracting the minerals from the earth was only the first step. The resources had to be refined and processed into valuable goods, metal alloys, jewelry, and other products that could be traded or used within the kingdom. The kingdom's blacksmiths, artisans, and merchants were enlisted to create these goods, working closely with the engineers and architects to develop the necessary facilities. Julian also saw the importance of securing the mineral resources for future generations. He understood that the prosperity of the kingdom was tied to its ability to manage these resources responsibly. Therefore, he set up a council of advisors, composed of experts in mining, engineering, economics, and trade, who would monitor the progress of the mining operations and ensure that the wealth generated was used to benefit the kingdom as a whole. Alina, ever vigilant, spent her time visiting the mining town, speaking with the workers and the leaders of the operation. She wanted to ensure that the workers were treated well and that the kingdom's ideals of fairness and prosperity were being realized on the ground. She personally oversaw the development of the education programs for the workers and made sure that the town's infrastructure, including healthcare and schooling for the children, was in place. As the months passed, the mining operations began to show results. Gold and silver were extracted from the depths of the earth, and iron and copper were smelted into ingots, ready to be forged into weapons, armor, and tools. The kingdom's coffers were soon overflowing with wealth, and the economy began to thrive. Julian and Alina, though busy with their royal duties, could see the effects of their hard work reflected in the growth of their people. With the riches flowing in from the mines, Julian had the funds he needed to continue his efforts to expand the kingdom's infrastructure. The roads and railways that had been built to support the mines were now being extended to other parts of the kingdom, opening up new regions for settlement and trade. The new resources also allowed the kingdom to invest in the arts, sciences, and education, fostering a golden age of knowledge and creativity. However, even with all this prosperity, Julian knew that the future of the kingdom depended on balance. He could not allow the pursuit of wealth to cloud his judgment. His commitment to his people and to his kingdom's future would always remain his highest priority. The new mines had brought prosperity, but Julian understood that true wealth came not just from the land's resources, but from the strength, unity, and resilience of the people who inhabited it. Together, they would continue to build a kingdom that would last for generations to come. The sun shone brightly over the kingdom, casting a golden hue over the vast fields, peaceful villages, and magnificent city that Julian and Alina had worked so hard to build. The kingdom, once a land of conflict and uncertainty, was now a beacon of prosperity, peace, and happiness. People walked the streets with smiles on their faces, their hearts light with the promise of a better future. Julian stood at the highest balcony of the royal palace, gazing out at the kingdom he had fought for. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the sounds of laughter and joy from the marketplace below. The construction of new homes and buildings had slowed, but life was vibrant. The kingdom had settled into a golden age, where peace prevailed, and people lived harmoniously, each day a testament to their shared efforts. Julian's heart swelled with pride as he watched his people, his family, flourish. Alina, by his side, held his hand tightly, her smile radiant. It was hard to believe how far they had come from the days of war and turmoil. Their kingdom was thriving, and now there was another source of joy that filled their hearts: the news of a new life. Alina was expecting a child, a son. This announcement had brought waves of excitement and joy throughout the kingdom. The people celebrated in the streets, their joy contagious. From the smallest child to the oldest elder, everyone shared in the happiness of the royal couple. The news spread like wildfire, and soon there were festivities everywhere. Banners with the royal crest were hung on every building, and people danced in the streets, celebrating not only the king's success but the future that was now within their grasp. The anticipation of the child's arrival brought the kingdom even closer together. It was a symbol of hope, of continuity, and of a new beginning. The child was to be the heir to the throne, the future king who would one day continue the legacy of peace, prosperity, and unity that Julian and Alina had built. The couple had always dreamt of this day. Julian had long imagined the joy of raising a child in a kingdom that was at peace, a child who would be surrounded by love and stability. Alina, too, had imagined this moment countless times, but never could she have foreseen the depth of her happiness. She watched Julian, his face lit with pride and love, as he gazed out at the kingdom. "This is just the beginning," Julian murmured, his voice full of emotion. "Our son will inherit a world that we've worked so hard to create. He will grow up in a land of peace and prosperity, a land that knows the value of unity and strength." Alina rested her head on his shoulder, her heart full of warmth. "We've done it, Julian. We've given the kingdom a future. And now, we have the most beautiful gift of all, a child." The news of Alina's pregnancy had not only brought joy to the royal family but also to the people. They saw this child as a promise, a new hope for the future of the kingdom. The royal couple had been through so much together: war, loss, and struggle, but now, with the arrival of their son, their love story was entering a new chapter, one filled with joy and anticipation. As the days passed, preparations for the child's arrival were underway. The palace was being decorated in the softest colors, and rooms were being prepared for the royal heir. Julian, despite his responsibilities as king, spent every moment he could with Alina, supporting her and preparing for the arrival of their son. The couple would often walk through the gardens, hand in hand, dreaming of what the future would hold for their family. The kingdom itself seemed to be in harmony with the news. Every corner of the land buzzed with excitement. Children played in the streets, dreaming of the day they would meet the prince. The farmers worked the fields with greater vigor, knowing that their efforts would help provide for the royal family and their future. The artisans created beautiful gifts for the royal child, eager to share in the joy that had gripped the kingdom. Julian's advisors, sensing the immense morale boost, ensured that the kingdom's economy remained strong. Trade routes flourished, and new alliances were formed with neighboring lands. The kingdom was not only at peace but also growing stronger each day. Julian, now with his wife by his side and a child on the way, could look toward the future with hope and confidence. He knew that the legacy of his family would live on, not just through the son they were about to welcome into the world, but through the unity and peace they had established. As night fell, Julian and Alina stood once more on the balcony, looking out at the peaceful kingdom below. The lights from the town glittered in the distance, and the sound of laughter and song carried on the wind. It was a kingdom at peace, a kingdom that had found its way through hardship and uncertainty. And now, it was poised to embrace a new beginning. Alina looked at Julian, her eyes full of love. "Our son will grow up in a kingdom of peace. A kingdom where his future is bright, and his heart will be full of hope." Julian nodded, a smile playing on his lips. A kingdom where his heart will always be safe, and his future will be as bright as the kingdom we've built. And together, they watched the stars twinkle in the night sky, the promise of tomorrow shining brightly, knowing that their love and their kingdom's strength would carry them into the future, one filled with hope, joy, and endless possibilities. The days passed by in a flurry of joy, anticipation, and love. It had been 9 months since Alina's pregnancy announcement, and the entire kingdom was awaiting the royal birth. The people of the land, from the smallest villages to the grand city, felt connected to the royal family's happiness, as the arrival of the heir was not just a private matter, it was a symbol of the kingdom's enduring legacy. Every corner of the kingdom felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the day that the royal children would be born. As the time drew near, the atmosphere in the palace was electric. Servants and advisors bustled about, making the final preparations for the arrival of the royal babies. Julian remained by Alina's side, his heart full of both excitement and protectiveness as the moment approached. He had dreamed of this day for years, and now it was finally here. He would soon become a father to 3 sons, each one destined to play a part in shaping the future of the kingdom. On the day of the birth, the palace was filled with an air of quiet excitement. The royal physicians were ready, and the palace staff had been instructed to ensure that everything would run smoothly. The royal couple, despite their nerves, remained calm. Julian, ever the stoic king, held Alina's hand as she labored with great strength. Alina, her face flushed with effort, smiled at her husband, knowing that this was a moment they would share forever. After hours of intense labor, the cries of 3 newborns echoed through the royal palace. Julian's heart swelled with joy and relief as he looked at his wife, exhausted but radiant with happiness. 3 sons, 3 heirs to the throne, had been born: Leo, Arthur, and Martin. The names held deep meaning for the royal couple. Leo, for its strength and courage; Arthur, after the legendary king who once ruled the lands; and Martin, for the warrior spirit and wisdom that would guide them through the ages. The birth of these 3 sons brought an indescribable sense of joy to the royal family. Not only had Alina and Julian been blessed with healthy children, but the kingdom had also received a new generation of future leaders. The palace erupted with cheers and celebrations as the news spread. The 3 princes were welcomed with open arms by the people, each one a symbol of hope for the future. The early years of the princes' lives were filled with love, joy, and the warmth of their parents' care. Julian and Alina were deeply involved in raising their sons, ensuring they were not only taught the ways of royalty but also the importance of compassion, justice, and unity. The royal couple spent countless hours with Leo, Arthur, and Martin, teaching them the values that had made their kingdom great. Leo, the eldest, showed signs of leadership even as a young child. He was strong-willed, intelligent, and fiercely protective of his younger brothers. Julian, recognizing Leo's natural ability to command, began teaching him the art of diplomacy, leadership, and strategy at an early age. Leo would often accompany his father on royal visits to neighboring lands, learning how to manage relations with other kingdoms and understanding the intricacies of governance. Arthur, the middle child, was a dreamer with a deep curiosity for the world. While his brothers focused on matters of power and leadership, Arthur's passion lay in exploration and discovery. From a young age, he was fascinated by the natural world, mountains, rivers, forests, and would often ask questions that left even the wisest of advisors pondering. He became the family's diplomat, traveling to faraway lands to broker peace treaties and build alliances. Arthur's open heart and curiosity led him to form connections with people from all walks of life, earning him the respect of both commoners and nobles alike. Martin, the youngest, was a fierce and independent spirit. He wasn't as eager to embrace the traditional duties of a prince, and at times, he clashed with his brothers and tutors. But it was in Martin's rebellious nature that the true strength of his character was revealed. He had an unshakable resolve and a deep sense of justice, often standing up for the underdog, even when it meant defying authority. Julian recognized his son's potential and made sure to channel Martin's rebellious energy into something productive, teaching him the importance of standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. As the years passed, the princes grew in wisdom and strength, each taking their own path. Despite their differences, they remained close, bound by the love of their family and the kingdom they were destined to lead. By the time they were 12, Leo, Arthur, and Martin had already begun taking on royal duties. Leo, being the eldest, was often seen by Julian's side, assisting with state affairs and learning the intricacies of leadership. He showed great promise as a future ruler, with his natural charisma and strategic mind. His ability to make difficult decisions with clarity was admired by all. Arthur, meanwhile, spent much of his time traveling. At the age of 13, he set out on his first diplomatic mission to a neighboring kingdom to negotiate trade agreements and alliances. His travels took him across mountains, through dense forests, and over vast plains. Along the way, Arthur made many friends, learned from different cultures, and discovered new ways to bridge the gaps between disparate peoples. Martin, though still rebellious, was slowly finding his place. At the age of 14, he began training with the Royal Guard, developing his skills in combat and strategy. Though his heart wasn't always in the courtly duties expected of him, he had a deep sense of loyalty to his family and kingdom. He was determined to become a protector of his people, even if it meant walking a different path than his brothers. As they entered their 15th year, the princes had become pillars of strength, each contributing to the kingdom in their own unique way. The royal court often found themselves in awe of the young men they had become. Leo, Arthur, and Martin were a reflection of their parents' love and guidance, and their future seemed brighter than ever. But even as the kingdom flourished, the princes were beginning to understand the weight of their destinies. They were no longer just children, they were the future of the realm. The expectations placed upon them grew with each passing day, and while they remained united in their love for one another, each prince began to feel the burden of leadership. The journey ahead was filled with challenges, but one thing was certain: the three brothers, Leo, Arthur, and Martin, would face the future together, side by side. The legacy of their parents, Julian and Alina, would continue, and the kingdom would thrive under their watchful eyes. As they approached their 16th year, the path of the kings would soon be in their hands, and they would prove to the world that they were worthy of the crown, just as their father had been before them. The time had come for the princes to make a decision, an important decision that would shape their futures. At the age of 15, Leo, Arthur, and Martin were no longer children, but young men who had learned much from their parents and the world around them. King Julian and Queen Alina had always believed in allowing their sons to choose their own paths, guiding them but not pushing them toward any particular destiny. It was a momentous day, one that would be remembered for years to come. The kingdom gathered to witness the three princes make their choices. Each prince was to select a profession that would become their life's work, a responsibility they would take on as future rulers and leaders. The king and queen, standing together in the grand hall of the palace, watched with proud hearts as their sons prepared to announce their choices. Julian had always known that each of his sons had unique talents and interests, and he was curious to see which path they would choose. Leo had always been a young man of deep intellect and curiosity. From the time he could walk, he was fascinated by the workings of the world around him. He would often dismantle mechanical objects, trying to understand how they worked, and he spent hours in the royal library, poring over ancient texts and scrolls on engineering and invention. His keen mind had made him a favorite among the scholars in the kingdom, and his ability to solve problems with precision and creativity had earned him respect from those who worked with him. Despite his aptitude for leadership and strategy, Leo felt a deep calling toward the world of engineering. His fascination with machines, architecture, and the mechanics of life had grown into a burning desire to contribute to the kingdom in a different way. One evening, as he sat by the fire with his father, Leo had expressed his thoughts to Julian. "I want to build, Father," Leo had said, his eyes filled with determination. "I want to create new machines, improve the infrastructure of our kingdom, and make life easier for our people. I don't want to rule the kingdom like you, but I want to shape its future in my own way, through innovation." At first, Julian had been surprised. His eldest son had shown such promise as a future king, and the idea of Leo stepping away from the throne had unsettled him. But as Leo explained his vision, Julian realized that his son was destined for something greater. He would help build the kingdom in ways they had not yet imagined. When Leo announced his decision to pursue a career as an engineer, the kingdom was supportive. He immediately began studying under the finest engineers in the land, learning the art of creating grand structures, devising new tools, and improving existing technologies. Leo's projects soon took shape. He designed better roads and bridges, making travel safer and more efficient. He built machines that improved farming and manufacturing processes, helping the kingdom prosper. Leo's mind and work soon became the backbone of the kingdom's growth, and he found fulfillment in his ability to create something that would last long after he was gone. Arthur, unlike his brothers, had always been drawn to the world beyond the palace walls. While Leo had buried himself in books and Martin had found joy in the outdoors, Arthur had spent his early years traveling with various diplomats, learning the art of negotiation and diplomacy. He had seen firsthand how wars could be avoided with careful words, and how alliances could be built through understanding and mutual respect. His heart longed for peace, and he knew his talents lay in connecting people and countries. In his youth, Arthur had been known for his charm, his ability to talk to anyone, and his quick thinking. He had befriended people from different lands, and wherever he went, he left a trail of goodwill and positive influence. Arthur could read people with ease, and he understood the power of words far more than most. To him, diplomacy was not just about representing the kingdom, it was about connecting hearts and minds, and building a world that could work together for the greater good. When it came time for Arthur to choose his path, there was no hesitation in his heart. He knew exactly what he wanted to do: become a diplomat for the kingdom. He wanted to continue the work of his mother, Queen Elena, who had brokered several peace treaties in her youth. Arthur wanted to travel the world, build relationships with other kingdoms, and ensure that the peace and prosperity of the kingdom would never be threatened. King Julian, though initially apprehensive about Arthur's decision, soon saw the wisdom in it. He knew that the future of the kingdom depended not only on military might but on the strength of alliances and the ability to negotiate peacefully. Arthur's gentle nature and sharp mind made him perfect for the role, and Julian could not help but be proud of his son's decision to be a diplomat. Arthur became known for his exceptional skills in negotiations, securing trade agreements, and keeping peace between warring factions. He traveled far and wide, visiting neighboring kingdoms and even distant lands to forge new alliances. His efforts in diplomacy brought prosperity to the kingdom, and soon, he became a trusted figure in foreign courts. Arthur had truly found his calling, and through his work, the kingdom's reputation for peace and goodwill spread across the world. Martin, the youngest of the three brothers, had always been the most independent and wild-hearted. While Leo sought knowledge and Arthur sought peace, Martin was drawn to the wilderness. From the time he could walk, Martin had shown a remarkable talent for survival. He had a natural connection with the land, an understanding of the animals that roamed it, and an ability to track and hunt with the skill of a seasoned hunter. As a child, Martin would spend hours in the forests surrounding the kingdom, honing his skills. He had no desire for the throne and was never interested in the courtly life. He had witnessed his brothers struggle with the pressure of their royal duties, and he knew that his future did not lie in ruling. Instead, Martin sought solace in the simplicity of nature and the thrill of the hunt. His father, King Julian, had often tried to convince him to take on a more traditional royal role, but Martin's heart was set on becoming the kingdom's finest hunter. When the time came for Martin to choose his future, he stood before his family and declared his intent: "I will become a hunter. Not just any hunter, but the protector of our land. I will ensure that our forests remain safe, that our wildlife thrives, and that our people are protected from the dangers of the wild." Julian, though initially hesitant, understood his son's deep connection to the natural world. He had seen Martin's skill with a bow, his ability to navigate the forests, and his keen sense of awareness. Martin was a natural protector, and his decision to dedicate himself to hunting was, in many ways, a decision to serve the kingdom in his own way. Over the years, Martin's skills grew. He became renowned as the kingdom's greatest hunter, able to track even the most elusive prey. He ventured into the deepest forests, protecting the kingdom's borders from wild beasts and poachers. Martin's bond with nature made him a revered figure, and his ability to provide for the kingdom and keep it safe earned him the admiration of both the people and the nobility. He was not a king, nor a diplomat, but Martin found his purpose in protecting the kingdom in a way that no one else could. As the years passed, Leo, Arthur, and Martin each carved out their own destinies. Though their paths diverged, the bond between the three brothers remained unbreakable. They had each chosen to follow their hearts, and in doing so, they had found true fulfillment. Their different paths would one day serve to strengthen the kingdom in ways none of them had initially imagined. Leo, the engineer, built the future of the kingdom with his inventions and innovations. Arthur, the diplomat, ensured that the kingdom's relations with other lands remained strong and peaceful. And Martin, the hunter, protected the kingdom from the dangers that lurked in the wilds. Each brother had found his purpose, and in doing so, they had proven that they were not just heirs to the throne, but champions of the kingdom in their own right. Their adventures had only just begun. Chapter 35. The Forgotten Cave. It was an unusually cold morning when Martin, the youngest of the three princes, ventured deep into the forest. The crisp, cool air swept through the towering trees, and the leaves rustled softly as if whispering ancient secrets. Martin had always found solace in nature, and this day was no different. As a skilled hunter, he had spent countless hours in these woods, tracking game and exploring every corner. However, this time, he had a different purpose. There was a strange pull, a feeling deep in his gut that urged him to go further, deeper into the forest, beyond the familiar paths. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden glow across the landscape as Martin moved through the dense underbrush. He had been following a trail for hours when he stumbled upon something strange, something he had never seen before. A rock, half hidden by thick vines, jutted out from the ground, appearing to lead to a narrow opening in the earth. His instincts kicked in, and despite the curiosity gnawing at him, he hesitated for a moment. The air around the rock felt different, damp, cool, and heavy. Something about this place seemed ancient, forgotten by time. Martin had always respected the power of the forest, knowing that there were places in nature that should remain undisturbed. But today, his curiosity got the better of him. With a deep breath, he pushed the vines aside and crawled through the narrow opening. As soon as he passed through, the light from the forest faded, and the temperature dropped significantly. Martin's heart raced as he moved further into the darkness. He carried only his bow and a small lantern, which he lit to illuminate the path ahead. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls damp with the passage of time. The air smelled musty, and the sound of dripping water echoed around him, making the cave feel alive in its eerie stillness. It wasn't long before Martin found himself in a vast underground cavern. The space was enormous, larger than any room he had ever seen, with high ceilings and stalactites hanging like sharp, frozen teeth from above. The floor was uneven, and as Martin took cautious steps forward, he noticed something that sent a shiver down his spine: ancient carvings and symbols on the walls. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, strange markings that seemed to tell a story of a civilization long lost to history, but before he could examine them further, the ground beneath him gave way. A loud crack echoed through the cavern, and Martin tumbled into a deep hole, his body flailing through the air as he fell. The world spun around him, and then darkness. When Martin awoke, his head was pounding, and his body ached from the fall. He tried to stand but stumbled, his legs weak from the shock. Slowly, he regained his senses and took in his surroundings. He was in a lower part of the cavern, surrounded by jagged rocks and deep shadows. The lantern had been knocked from his hand, but it was still flickering faintly in the distance. As he moved toward it, he noticed that the cavern seemed to open up even more. There were several tunnels, leading deeper into the earth. But his focus was on something else. A figure there, standing in the dim light, was a young woman. She was crouched down, carefully examining the ground, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes met Martin's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She was unlike anyone Martin had ever encountered. Her skin was tanned, her clothes simple but practical, and she radiated a quiet strength, a connection to the earth itself. It was as if she belonged to this place. "You're hurt," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. Martin, still groggy, nodded. His head throbbed, but he could feel his limbs beginning to regain strength. "I fell," he muttered, rubbing his forehead. "I didn't expect to find anything like this." The woman helped him to his feet, her grip surprisingly firm. "This place is ancient. No one comes here anymore. It's dangerous." She paused, glancing at the surrounding tunnels. "But I can help you." She led Martin through the cavern, her movements swift and sure, as if she knew these tunnels like the back of her hand. She took him to a small, hidden alcove where she had set up camp. There, she tended to his injuries with herbal remedies, her skill with healing evident in every gesture. As she worked, Martin watched her, intrigued by her knowledge of the natural world and the calm confidence she exuded. Over the next few days, the woman, whose name was Alara, taught Martin about the cave and its secrets. She was a healer, living alone in the cavern, far from the kingdom and its wars. She had discovered this place years ago, hidden deep in the forest, and had made it her home. Martin had no idea how she had come to live here, but he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of familiarity with her. They spent hours together, talking about their lives, the world above, and the mysteries that lay beneath the earth. During this time, something unexpected happened. Martin found himself drawn to Alara in a way he couldn't explain. Her presence was calming, and her wisdom was vast. She had an aura about her, an ancient, powerful connection to the earth that Martin could not ignore. He began to feel as though this place had been waiting for him, that his fall into the cave was no accident. Perhaps it was fate. Meanwhile, back in the kingdom, his brothers, Leo and Arthur, had grown worried about his disappearance. They gathered a team of soldiers and set out to search for Martin, determined to bring him back. Leo, ever the engineer, began to devise a plan to navigate the tunnels beneath the forest, using maps and blueprints from the royal archives. Arthur, with his diplomatic skills, sought the help of the local villagers, who had spoken of strange occurrences in the forest and whispered about an ancient civilization hidden beneath the earth. As the days passed, Martin's bond with Alara deepened. They began to explore the caves together, discovering hidden treasures and relics left behind by a long-lost civilization. One day, as they ventured into a new part of the cave, Martin stumbled upon something incredible, a vein of precious metal, glittering in the dim light. It was gold, but not just any gold. This was a rare, magical alloy, stronger than steel and capable of withstanding immense pressure. Martin was astonished. He realized that this discovery could change everything for the kingdom. The metal could be used to create advanced tools, weapons, and structures that would revolutionize the kingdom's capabilities. He immediately began to think of ways to extract it and bring it back to the surface. But to do so, he would need to rely on the one person who could help him, the brilliant engineer, his brother Leo. Back in the kingdom, Leo had been working tirelessly on new technologies, and the news of Martin's discovery reached him. As soon as he heard, Leo was eager to explore this new opportunity. He designed a specialized mining system, utilizing his engineering skills to develop a way to extract the precious metal from the depths of the cave. With the help of his team, Leo crafted the tools necessary to begin the extraction process, but there was a catch. The cave's structure was unstable, and the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. It was Alara who warned them. She knew the cave's fragile nature better than anyone, and she urged caution. If they were to continue, they would need to be careful, or else the entire cave could collapse. As the brothers worked with Alara, they realized that the discovery was not only valuable for the kingdom but also a symbol of the untapped potential beneath the earth, potential that could change the future of the kingdom forever. But for Martin, this adventure was more than just a quest for treasure. It was a journey of self-discovery, of realizing his purpose in the world and his connection to something greater than himself. And it was there, in the heart of the cave, that Martin understood the true meaning of destiny. It wasn't just about the wealth or the power, it was about the people he met, the lessons he learned, and the world he had come to understand. As he stood beside Alara, watching the sun set through the cave's entrance, he knew his life had forever been changed, and so, with the promise of new beginnings and the weight of his discoveries, Martin returned to the kingdom, ready to share the knowledge he had gained and the incredible journey he had experienced. The future of the kingdom was brighter than ever, and the path ahead was full of endless possibilities. Leo stood at the mouth of the ancient cavern, his tools clinking softly as he set up for another day of work. The revolutionary mining system he'd designed was in full operation, slowly extracting the rare and magical alloy hidden deep beneath the earth. Martin's discovery had already begun transforming the kingdom, and Leo knew that what lay in these caves would solidify their place in history, but something felt different today. The air was heavier, carrying an uneasy stillness that even the echo of dripping water couldn't fill. Leo brushed off the feeling, attributing it to exhaustion. As he worked, the dim light of the lanterns illuminated strange shadows on the cave walls, and for the first time, the ancient carvings seemed less like relics and more like warnings. Far above the cavern, in the icy peaks of the northern mountains, a band of savage marauders had been watching the kingdom for weeks. These were not ordinary raiders. They were a fearsome and brutal clan, their faces scarred and their hearts full of hatred. Known as the Bloodfangs, they were notorious for their ruthless tactics and disdain for the rule of law. Their leader, a towering figure called Valka, had heard of the kingdom's newfound wealth and strength. He saw the thriving nation not as an ally or a rival but as an affront to his chaotic way of life. Under the cover of darkness, the Bloodfangs descended from the mountains, their movements swift and deliberate. They slaughtered anyone they encountered without mercy, their battle cries echoing across the valleys. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of the kingdom, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Leo had no idea the Bloodfangs were closing in. Deep in the cave, his focus was on refining the mining process, oblivious to the chaos unfolding above. But then he heard it, a distant roar, faint but unmistakable. The sound sent a chill down his spine. He froze, straining to listen, and then the ground beneath him trembled. Before he could react, the Bloodfangs stormed the cavern. They came like a plague, overwhelming the workers with terrifying efficiency. Leo tried to flee, but they caught him, dragging him into the light. Valka himself stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating as he looked down at the young engineer. "So, this is the great inventor," Valka sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Your machines will die with you, boy." Leo, defiant to the end, spat at Valka's feet. "You'll never understand what we've built here. You're nothing but beasts, living in shadows." Valka's grin widened. "And yet, here we stand, tearing down your mighty kingdom." Without another word, he drove his blade through Leo's chest, silencing him forever. Word of the attack reached the castle as the royal family prepared a ceremony to honor Leo's achievements. The news of his death struck the kingdom like a hammer, and grief rippled through the palace. Queen Elena, pregnant with another child, collapsed in tears while Arthur and Martin stood in stunned silence, their hearts filled with rage and disbelief. A funeral was hastily arranged, and the entire kingdom gathered to mourn the loss of their beloved prince. The streets were lined with grieving citizens, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The royal family stood at the forefront of the procession, their heads bowed in sorrow, but the Bloodfangs were not done. Valka had planned his next move meticulously, and the funeral provided the perfect opportunity. As the royal family and their subjects gathered to pay their respects, the marauders launched their second wave of attack. The Bloodfangs descended upon the crowd like wolves among sheep. Chaos erupted as men, women, and children were cut down without mercy. Flames consumed the nearby buildings, and the air filled with screams and the clash of steel. Arthur, the diplomat, quickly tried to organize the surviving guards, shouting commands over the deafening roar of the battle. "Protect the queen," he bellowed, drawing his sword and stepping into the fray. Martin, the hunter, stayed close to their mother, his bow snapping arrow after arrow into the oncoming horde. But it was no use. The Bloodfangs were too many, and their savagery unmatched. In the chaos, Queen Elena was struck by a flying arrow. She fell to the ground, clutching her abdomen as blood pooled beneath her. Martin screamed, dropping to her side. "Mother, stay with me," he cried, but her strength was fading fast. Arthur pulled Martin to his feet, his face pale with anguish. "We have to go. Now." Reluctantly, Martin followed his brother, dragging their mother's limp body to the safety of a nearby alley. Behind them, the Bloodfangs pushed further into the castle grounds. The marauders stormed the palace, slaughtering the last of the royal guards and tearing through the halls. Valka himself ascended to the throne room, his blooded blade in hand. He sat on the king's throne, surveying the destruction with a twisted smile. The kingdom had fallen, but not all hope was lost. Arthur and Martin, along with a handful of survivors, fled into the wilderness under the cover of night. They moved quickly and silently, their hearts heavy with grief and fury. Somewhere along the way, they realized their father, the king, had been separated from them in the chaos. As they regrouped in the safety of the forest, Arthur turned to the small group of survivors. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "We'll rebuild. We'll take back what's ours." Martin nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. "They'll regret the day they came for our family." And so, with their kingdom in ruins and their family shattered, the brothers began to plot their revenge. The Bloodfangs had taken everything from them, but they would not be allowed to keep it. The fight for the kingdom was far from over. 2 years had passed since the kingdom's fall, and the pain of that day still burned in Arthur's heart. Once a confident diplomat, skilled in negotiation and tact, he had transformed into a hardened leader. Hidden deep in the forested mountains, Arthur, Martin, and their small band of loyalists had spent those years regrouping, training, and plotting. Every move was calculated, every resource rationed. Arthur knew the only way to defeat the Bloodfangs was to use the very skills he had once wielded to forge alliances, strategy, cunning, and diplomacy. Martin, now a skilled tracker and hunter, had become their lifeline in the wilderness. His knowledge of the terrain kept their group hidden from Valka's patrols, and his bow ensured that they never went hungry. Yet even Martin, despite his resilience, often gazed toward the distant peaks with a longing that could not be hidden. "Our people are still suffering," Martin said one night as the two brothers sat around the campfire. "Every day we stay here, Valka tightens his grip on what's left of the kingdom." Arthur's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "We'll take it back," he said firmly. "Not with brute force, but with precision. The Bloodfangs aren't invincible, Martin. Everyone has a weakness. We just need to find theirs." The opportunity came sooner than expected. While scouting the forest one day, the brothers stumbled upon a small, isolated village nestled in a hidden valley. The villagers were wary at first, recognizing Arthur and Martin as remnants of the fallen royal family. But as the brothers shared their story and their plans to reclaim the kingdom, the villagers' fear gave way to hope. One elder, a frail but sharp-eyed woman named Idria, came forward with a revelation. "The Bloodfangs may seem unstoppable," she said, her voice low and trembling, "but their strength lies in more than just their savagery. Valka's rise to power was aided by something unnatural." Arthur leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean?" Idria gestured for them to follow her into a small hut, where she pulled a dusty map from a locked chest. Spreading it across a wooden table, she pointed to a spot deep within the mountains. "There," she said. "The Cavern of Shadows. It's an ancient place, older than the kingdom itself. Legends say Valka found something there, something that gave him the power to rally the Bloodfangs and destroy your kingdom." Martin frowned. What kind of something are we talking about? A weapon? Magic? Idria shook her head. No one knows for certain. But whatever it is, it gave Valka control over his men. They follow him not just out of loyalty, but out of fear. If you want to defeat him, you must go to the cavern and uncover its secrets. Arthur studied the map, his mind racing. If we can find a way to break Valka's hold on his men, we can turn them against him. Without his army, he's vulnerable. The elder nodded. But be warned, the cavern is treacherous, and many who enter never return. Determined to uncover the truth, Arthur and Martin set out the next morning, accompanied by a handful of their most trusted allies. The journey was perilous, the narrow mountain paths fraught with danger. Landslides, freezing winds, and hidden predators tested their resolve at every turn as they approached the cavern. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The entrance was marked by ancient runes carved into the stone, their meaning long forgotten. Inside, the darkness was absolute, the only light coming from the flickering torches they carried. The group ventured deeper, their footsteps echoing off the jagged walls. Strange whispers seemed to emanate from the shadows, and more than once, someone swore they saw movement out of the corner of their eye. Finally, they reached a vast chamber at the heart of the cavern. At its center stood an ominous altar, surrounded by skeletal remains and remnants of ancient rituals. On the altar lay a black, jagged crystal, pulsing faintly with an eerie light. Arthur approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "This must be it," he said, reaching out to touch the crystal. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a wave of visions flooded his mind. Valka finding the crystal, using its power to bend the Bloodfangs to his will, and the destruction of their kingdom. Arthur pulled back, gasping for air. "It's a source of control," he said, turning to the others. "Valka uses this to keep his men in line. If we destroy it, they'll turn on him." Martin stepped forward, his expression grim. "Then let's finish this." Using a hammer brought for the journey, Martin struck the crystal with all his might. It shattered with a deafening crack, releasing a shockwave that shook the entire cavern. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a strange sense of calm. As the group emerged from the cavern, the first light of dawn bathed the mountains in gold. They hurried back to the village, where Idria awaited their return. "The crystal is gone," Arthur said. "Valka's power over his men should be broken." Idria smiled faintly. "You've taken the first step, but the battle is far from over. Without his control, Valka will grow desperate. He'll strike out with what's left of his forces." Arthur nodded. "Then we'll be ready. We'll gather what allies we can, infiltrate the palace, and take back what's ours without spilling unnecessary blood." Martin grinned, his confidence renewed. "And if Valka wants a fight, we'll give him one." With their resolve stronger than ever, the brothers began preparations for the next phase of their plan. The kingdom's future was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, hope burned brightly in their hearts. The time to reclaim their throne was drawing near. The days spent in the hidden village passed quickly. Arthur, Martin, and their small group were treated as honored guests, their spirits lifted by the hospitality of the villagers. Though the brothers were grateful for the warmth and camaraderie, their minds remained fixed on the mission ahead, reclaiming the kingdom. The information shared by Idria about the hidden tunnels and the Bloodfang's ignorance of new military technologies was invaluable. Late one evening, as the group gathered around the village fire, Arthur spoke with determination. "Our time here has been a blessing," he said, his voice steady. But we can't stay any longer. The palace is waiting, and so are our people." The villagers nodded solemnly, their eyes filled with respect and hope. Idria approached with a bundle of maps, offering them to Arthur. "These are old, passed down through generations," she said. The villagers nodded solemnly, their eyes filled with respect and hope. Idria approached with a bundle of maps, offering them to Arthur. "These are old, passed down through generations," she said. "They show the secret tunnels beneath the palace. They were built centuries ago as escape routes for the royal family, but they can now serve as your way in." Martin studied the maps closely, his sharp eyes tracing the pathways. "If these tunnels are still intact, they'll lead us directly to the heart of the palace. Valka won't see us coming. But it won't be easy," Idria warned. "The Bloodfangs are ruthless, and the tunnels are likely treacherous after years of disuse." Arthur nodded. "We'll take the risk. The alternative is a full assault, and that would cost too many lives." The group spent the next few days preparing for the perilous journey. The villagers supplied them with provisions, weapons, and tools. Among their supplies were several prototypes of the kingdom's new war technology, compact, portable flame devices and reinforced armor crafted from the region's unique minerals. Arthur also made time to train the group in stealth tactics, drawing on his diplomatic experience to teach them how to think like infiltrators. "Speed and silence will be our greatest allies," he said during one training session. "If we're discovered before we reach the palace's inner chambers, it's over." Martin, meanwhile, focused on sharpening his hunting skills. He knew the journey through the mountains and tunnels would require not only cunning but also physical endurance and survival expertise. On the morning of their departure, the villagers gathered to see them off. Idria gave Arthur a final piece of advice. "Trust each other," she said. "And remember, the strength of your bond is greater than any weapon." With those words, the group set out, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission but also buoyed by the villagers' faith in them. The first leg of the journey took them through dense forests and rugged mountain trails. The landscape was both beautiful and unforgiving, with towering cliffs and roaring rivers. Martin led the way, his keen senses guiding them safely through the wilderness. One night, as they camped near a quiet glade, Arthur and Martin spoke about the challenges ahead. "Do you think we'll succeed?" Martin asked, staring into the fire. Arthur hesitated before replying. "We have to. Not just for us, but for everyone who's counting on us." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of rustling in the bushes. The group quickly drew their weapons, only to find a young deer wandering into the clearing. Martin lowered his bow with a smile. "Even in dark times, life finds a way," he said. The moment of peace was brief, but it reminded them of what they were fighting for, a future where their people could live without fear. After days of travel, the group finally reached the entrance to the secret tunnels. Hidden behind a waterfall, the entrance was marked by ancient carvings that matched those on Idria's maps. "Let's hope these tunnels are as hidden as they seem," Arthur said, leading the group inside. The air grew colder as they descended into the depths. The tunnels were narrow and damp, with roots and stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Their torches cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. As they navigated the labyrinthine passages, they encountered numerous obstacles, collapsed sections, underground streams, and even nests of venomous creatures. Martin's tracking skills proved invaluable, helping them find alternate routes and avoid dangers. At one point, they discovered a collapsed chamber filled with ancient relics and forgotten treasures. Among the items was a rusted sword bearing the royal crest. Arthur picked it up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "These tunnels were built by our ancestors," he said. "Their strength flows through us. We won't fail." After hours of navigating the tunnels, the group reached a section that matched the map's description of the palace's underground chambers. They could hear muffled voices above, a reminder of the danger that awaited them. Arthur gathered the group for a final briefing. "We're close," he said. "From here, we split into 2 teams. Martin, you'll take half the group and secure the exits. The rest will come with me to infiltrate the palace's inner chambers. Once we're inside, we'll use the element of surprise to our advantage." Martin nodded. "We've come too far to turn back now." With their plan in place, the group moved cautiously through the final stretch of tunnels. The air was thick with tension, but their determination remained unshaken. As they reached the hidden entrance to the palace, Arthur turned to his companions. "This is it," he said. "The beginning of the end. Let's take back what's ours." The palace was eerily silent in the aftermath of its recapture. Walls once adorned with vibrant banners were scorched and crumbled. Floors polished by years of royal tradition were now marred with blood and ash. Arthur and Martin stood side by side in the great throne room, their faces grim as they surveyed the ruins of what was once their father's proud kingdom. The people had begun to return to the capital, filling its streets with life once more. But the kingdom was fractured, its spirit shaken by the brutal occupation and the loss of their beloved King Julian. His death had left a void not only in their hearts but also on the throne. Arthur, Martin, and the remaining royal advisors convened in the council chamber, now hastily repaired for an urgent meeting. "The kingdom needs stability," said Lady Idris, the chief advisor. Her voice was firm, though her eyes betrayed the weariness of the past few years. "We need a leader, now more than ever. But who will it be?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Arthur and Martin. Arthur was the eldest surviving son and had long been groomed for diplomacy and leadership. His calm demeanor and strategic mind had been instrumental in reclaiming the kingdom. Many believed he was the natural choice for king, but Martin, the younger brother, had captured the hearts of the people with his bravery and resilience. His time in the forests, living among the common folk and leading guerrilla efforts, had made him a symbol of hope and unity. Arthur spoke first, his tone measured. "The crown is not a prize to be won, but a burden to be carried. I have no desire for power, but I will serve if that is what the kingdom needs." Martin shook his head, his voice filled with conviction. "Arthur, you are the better choice. You've spent your life preparing for this. I'm just a hunter. My place is with the people, not on a throne." Lady Idris interjected. "The decision cannot be made by the 2 of you alone. The people must have a say. Let the council deliberate, and let the voices of the kingdom be heard." While the question of succession loomed, the brothers turned their attention to rebuilding the kingdom. The first order of business was restoring the palace, both as a symbol of royal authority and as a functional center of governance. Workers from across the realm came to assist in the reconstruction. Architects drew up plans not only to repair the damage but also to reinforce the palace against future threats. Martin took charge of overseeing the labor, working alongside the builders and ensuring that every hand, noble or commoner, was treated with respect. Arthur focused on re-establishing diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms. The Bloodfang's occupation had strained alliances, and it was crucial to secure their support. Letters were sent, emissaries dispatched, and treaties renegotiated among the people. There was a growing sense of hope. Markets reopened, children played in the streets, and celebrations were held to honor the heroes who had reclaimed the kingdom. As the palace neared completion, a grand assembly was called. Representatives from every corner of the kingdom were invited to the capital to discuss the future of the throne. The gathering was held in the newly restored Great Hall, its walls once again adorned with banners representing the realm's regions. Arthur and Martin stood before the assembly, their faces reflecting both confidence and humility. "We stand here today not as rivals, but as brothers," Arthur began. "Our father taught us that leadership is not about power, but about service. The crown belongs to the people, and it is their will that should guide us." Martin stepped forward. "I have fought alongside many of you, shared in your struggles and triumphs. I know what it means to suffer loss and to rebuild. But I also know that this kingdom needs someone who can lead it with wisdom and foresight. That person is my brother." The hall erupted in applause, though some murmurs of dissent could still be heard. Lady Idris rose to address the assembly. "The brothers have spoken, but the decision must be ours. Let us vote, here and now, for the future of our kingdom." The vote was held in solemn silence. Each representative stepped forward to cast their decision, placing a stone into one of two urns, one for Arthur, the other for Martin. When the final stone was counted, the result was clear. Arthur would be the new king. As the hall erupted into cheers, Arthur stood with a sense of both pride and trepidation. He turned to Martin, who clasped his shoulder firmly. "You'll be a great king," Martin said, "and I'll need you by my side," Arthur replied. Arthur's coronation was held a week later, a ceremony that marked not only his ascent to the throne but also the kingdom's resilience and unity. He pledged to rule with fairness and compassion, to honor his father's legacy, and to ensure that the kingdom would never again fall to darkness. Martin was appointed High Protector of the realm, a position that allowed him to continue his work among the people and oversee the kingdom's defenses.